The individual's name is Du Jongsung. He was a covert officer embedded within a criminal organization. However, regrettably, his disguise was uncovered quite some time ago. At present, he is being submerged beneath the surface by assailants and subjected to severe torment. When he ultimately inhales a breath of crisp air, the fair-haired criminal is already present with a blade, insisting on his subsequent action. As a result of, since he won't speak, the man approaches the supervisor to inquire about how to manage him. The supervisor sneers. In his view, every officer is worthy of demise, particularly the rodents. He rises and strides over. The strain causes the fair-haired brutes to lose their composure. He attempts to persuade the superior against it, arguing that it will lead to unwarranted complications. However, the supervisor disregards him and seizes the knife. His gaze is chillingly frigid. The fair-haired ruffian begins to grovel, assuring that he will manage the job discreetly. However, in the following moment, the employer plunges the blade directly into him. Before he has a chance to respond, the supervisor is throttling the breath out of him. It appears that this fair-haired individual was also an informant. The supervisor perceived his true nature from the beginning. As the hold intensifies, the blonde man's shouts become increasingly dreadful. Jong Sung is perspiring profusely. In order to endure, he intensifies his efforts and reveals the other individual. He asserts that he has severed ties with the department. He pleads for an opportunity, vowing his allegiance to the superior. The fair-haired man is astounded. He finds it hard to fathom that his own associate would betray him in such a manner. Yet, before he can speak a single word, the supervisor flings him aside like refuse. He believes he's secure, but suddenly, a ferocious blow crashes directly into his visage. The impact propels him several meters backward. Two of his teeth are dislodged instantly. His feet are already sealed in concrete. There's no way out. What the supervisor loathes the most are treacherous scoundrels. He concedes that Du is far more proficient than that other useless individual, so he will permit him to perish as a member of the gang. In mere moments, the location is engulfed in fire. Both moles are consumed by the blaze. The supervisor thrusts his hands into his pockets and strolls off, as if he has just disposed of some refuse. In the meantime, on the other side of the city, our protagonist, Masato, is contending with a driving under the influence charge. The issue is, the reckless motorist is being an absolute nuisance. Masato lacks the inclination for conversation. He approaches, yet the individual swats his hand aside. The punk's visage is flushed crimson, reeking of alcohol, yelling that he hasn't consumed a single drop. He possesses a visage that you simply feel compelled to strike. The foul odor of alcohol was the final tipping point. Masato ran out of tolerance and commanded the man to relinquish his permit. However, the delinquent became frantic and pressed the accelerator all the way down. He attempted to escape and groaned in the course of it. Here's the astonishing aspect. Ma didn't get struck. Instead, he surged forward and grasped the speeding vehicle like a ferocious creature. He gazed directly at the motorist through the pane, appearing utterly disinterested. It nearly caused the rebel to lose control. The vehicle was reaching 80 kilometers per hour. Nevertheless, Ma remained unwavering, although clearly irritated. He fervently wished to exit this ordeal, so he resolved to confront the situation with his fists. In the following instant, his fist shattered through the glass and connected with the man's visage. The force was so immense, the vehicle swerved uncontrollably, and the collision propelled Ma into the road. The automobile swayed laterally along the roadway for a moment, prior to encircling itself flawlessly around a utility post. Masato experienced a sense of helplessness. He merely wished for the vehicle to halt, but ultimately created a larger predicament than he had anticipated. Regarding the two goons inside, they were rendered unconscious instantly. Unavoidably, Ma was summoned back to the precinct for a significant reprimand from his superior, Lee Sang-yun. This wasn't his initial experience. Lee had been tidying up Ma's troubles for quite some time. Ma felt completely aggrieved. It wasn't his responsibility, yet the superiors just wouldn't leave him alone. Lee Sang-yun dismissed all of it. To him, Masato represented a calamity on two legs who had already depleted the station's finances. Lee's irritation was escalating with each passing moment. He had enlisted Ma to take charge, yet instead he was about to conclude, but Ma interrupted him and insisted on a reassignment to the front line. Since the very first day, he had been striving for the Significant Offenses Division. He never anticipated being confined to issuing citations. Lee dismissed him immediately. To him, a person who spreads disorder wherever he goes has no place in serious offenses. Even Ma's letters of apology seemed to convey a warning. Lee ran his fingers through his hair in utter exasperation. The Huang gang predicament was already a disaster, and now Ma was adding to the chaos. As soon as Ma caught wind of the term gang, his eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Lee attempted to remain subdued, yet Ma persisted in probing, ultimately pounding his fist on the table in exhilaration. A spirits container on the tabletop became an unfortunate victim of that shift. Faced with no alternative, Lee divulged the entire narrative. The Huang Gang originated in 1990 following the government's dismantling of the Byamchong Gang. The remnants reassembled into their current form. They ascended rapidly, supported by Chairman Zhang of the youth organization, an individual who maneuvered influence throughout the entire political landscape. In straightforward terms, they are a group with traditional origins and corporate backing. They exhibit no limitations. The authorities dispatched 2 covert operatives into the hideout, yet both were viciously slain once their concealment was exposed. The inquiry came to a halt as the powerful safeguarded them. Even Ma Suk-do was astonished. He couldn't fathom their audacity to aim at law enforcement officers. It was at that moment that Lee Sang-yong ultimately revealed the shocking news. The leader of the Huang Gang, the individual regarded as the most formidable enforcer since the illustrious Kim Do-han, is Jo Tis. Law enforcement has been eager to apprehend him, yet the individual remains elusive. He consistently conceals his identity, and there is invariably a subordinate prepared to accept the blame on his behalf. To undermine Zhou, they require solid evidence of his connections to Chairman Zhang. Upon hearing the name Jo Tis, Ma Suk-do becomes motionless. He is intimately familiar with that name. Even Lee was taken aback by the depth of history these two shared. It appears that Ma and Zhou were schoolmates during their high school years, yet their paths did not cross in the classroom. Instead, they encountered each other in the boxing arena. At that time, Zhou was a formidable force with an unblemished record of 26 victories and 1 tie. He dominated the Rookie of the Year accolades and secured the national title. Ma could never come to terms with that defeat. He confronted Zhou numerous additional times throughout the years, yet the golden child of boxing abruptly disappeared without a sign. Following a couple of beverages, Ma becomes loquacious. He confesses that the sole motivation for taking up boxing was to eventually deliver a thorough thrashing to Jo Tis. However, observe them at this moment. Zhou is enjoying a luxurious lifestyle while Ma is confined to adhering to strict rules. He quips that perhaps he ought to have chosen the path of a delinquent as well. Lee retorts sharply, urging him to be mindful of his words. Ma retreats with a grin, asserting it was merely a jest. However, at that moment, an inspiration hits Lee Sung-young. He gazes at Ma and inquires, "Do you genuinely desire to delve into major crimes that fervently?" The scene transitions to the wharves, a peripheral domain of the Huang Syndicate. A couple of ruffians are loitering in front of a freight container. They are lamenting their status as mere low-tier lackeys after all this time, while chatting about the newcomer that has captured everyone's attention. Mention the devil and he materializes. An opulent vehicle comes to a halt as the fresh consultant emerges. The Huang crew was once merely a force of strength. To advance their capabilities, they brought on an intellect. This is So Sun Up, the organization's third-ranking tactician. "Greetings, everything is tranquil, so please depart. I have tasks to complete for the supervisor." He cautions the subordinates to keep their distance while he is engaged in his tasks, or they will face the consequences. The container gates creak ajar, unveiling lines of females adorned in thick cosmetics. Seo takes a seat like an arbiter and begins allocating the shifts for the day. The youth frequent the nightclubs, while the older generation visits the tea establishments. Even the unadorned older females are paired with locations that meet his criteria. Once he's finished, he ignites a cigarette, wearing an expression of revulsion. He's a university alumnus, for heaven's sake. And here he is, behaving like a procurer for a cohort of women. He identifies Ms. Kim, who approaches him with apprehension. Seo begins to explore her body, nonchalantly suggesting that he could arrange for her to receive breast augmentation. Ms. Kim appears perplexed and distinctly uneasy. However, before she can fully comprehend it, Seo's requests become increasingly explicit and immoral. Ms. Kim becomes frantic, ensnared in the confined area with no escape, and her frantic efforts to evade him ultimately sever Seo's fragile strand of forbearance. Just at that instant, a voice shattered the silence of the radio, one of the thugs announcing that a cohort of girls had come for the audition. Irritated by the disruption, Seo's synapses fired at them to cease pestering him with trivial nonsense. However, the thug mentioned an additional point: "Chief, these women are exceptionally well endowed." Upon hearing that, Seo instinctively likened them to Ms. Kim, who was seated beside him. He altered his decision immediately. "Have them enter now." The container doors creaked open once more, and a woman entered, her long golden tresses cascading down her shoulders. An abnormally large torso. Her cosmetics were heavy enough to be considered a masterpiece. She was brandishing a metal pipe, and the moment she spotted Seo, she exclaimed playfully, "Appa!" Seo's eyes almost bulged from their sockets. He nearly gagged on the previous day's meal. Following her, a complete row of identical muscle-bound dolls marched marched in. Prior to his ability to shout, the chief abandoned the pretense. They belonged to the opposing Blackfish faction. Seo turned ghostly white. This was a blow. He couldn't comprehend how they managed to bypass the security measures. The gang leader scoffed, "Attribute it to your window tint. It's so opaque that your crew assumed it was you returning and simply gestured for us to pass. Concerning the sentinels at the entrance, they have been effectively subdued." Seo attempted to remain composed, cautioning them not to test their fortune. However, they possessed the figures and a catalog of his transgressions, usurping land, abusing women. This evening, Seo was a doomed man on the move. Faced with the imminent threat to his existence, Seo crumpled like a collapsible chair. He assigned all the blame to Jotees and attempted to bribe them. However, before he could complete his thought, they forcefully thrust an ashtray into his mouth to silence him. They didn't seek riches this evening. They desired his downfall. Discovering Seo's disfigured remains would serve as the definitive caution to the Huang Syndicate. Just then, a colossal hand seized the thug's inked arm. Abruptly, the most excruciatingly unbearable, spirit-destroying melody conceivable erupted through the microphone and into the ears of everyone present. The muscular figure resembling a drag queen was none other than Ma Sakto. He was completely absorbed in his own lethal performance, focused intently on the melodies, showing no concern for anyone's hearing. The gang leader ultimately comprehended that this infernal vocalist was not affiliated with his crew. However, prior to him being able to swing, Ma Sakto's fist collided with his visage. The force was iconic, rendering the man rigid as a plank, akin to a marionette with its strings severed. Ma ultimately clarified his interview. He had come across the advertisement for well-compensated hostesses and chose to submit his application. Why this location? Because he possessed information indicating that the Blackfish Syndicate would launch an assault tonight, the final hint from a deceased ally. Their objective was Seo Sangyop, and Ma required him unharmed to ascend the ranks to the pinnacle. He banged the microphone against the table, unleashing a shrill cry of interference that reverberated throughout the room. Everyone bent over, grasping their ears in torment. Only Ma Sakto remained unperturbed, progressing like a formidable antagonist stepping into the arena. Then arrived the highlight reel. Ma Sakto dispatching toughs with solitary strikes, sending the entire group howling for compassion. However, the leader executed a stealthy assault, ensnaring Ma in a frantic embrace from behind. The man smirked, believing he had the upper hand. Ma simply appeared uninterested, his gaze conveying, "Is that all?" Just as the metal conduit was descending, Ma Sakto lost his composure. He raised a leg and brought those stilettos crashing down onto the criminal's foot. A chilling shriek burst forth from behind. The situation shifted immediately, and the criminal discovered the true essence of excruciating torment. Ma intercepted an approaching strike with one hand and executed a backward elbow that struck the visage of the adversary behind him. While the man was still suspended in the air when Ma delivered a formidable blow that propelled him several yards away. In a matter of moments, the Blackfish crew were sprawled on the ground, beseeching like feeble cowards. Subsequently, Seo Sonyip hobbled forward to express his gratitude. He realized he would be lifeless were it not for this formidable woman before him. Observing the precision of Ma's maneuvers, Seo speculated that he was an undercover ally dispatched by the syndicate, one of their own. Ma derided the expression. He remarked that his former team had departed long ago. Now he simply existed as a solitary predator. He informed Seo that he intended to reform, and that he had only attended the interview to earn some quick cash. He asserted that he intervened solely because he could not tolerate witnessing a slaughter. Seo gazed at his wounded hand, coming to the understanding that, in this realm, power determines justice. As a clever tactician, he urgently required a powerhouse to support him. This individual was a blessing. At that very moment, he resolved to take Ma under his guidance. This was precisely Ma's strategy, but he needed to act elusive. He donned a distressed expression and refused, stating he wished to avoid slinking back into the abyss. He pivoted to depart. Seo rushed to restrain him, letting go of a thick cord. A fish is meant for water, and if you wish to cleanse your hands, you require funds to accomplish that. He assured Ma he would earn 100-fold more than his previous salary. Unfortunate Seo was unaware that he was stepping into a snare. He ignited a cigarette and began boasting about the illustrious Huang gang. Subsequently, he retrieved another cigarette, extended it towards Ma, and encouraged him to become part of the triumphant squad. Ma accepted the cigarette effortlessly. For the objective and for significant offenses, he ceased the performance. He gazed directly into Seo's eyes and inquired, "Should I begin addressing you as chief?" And just like that, Ma Siapto abandoned the uniform and ventured onto the perilous edge of clandestine existence. In reality, rescuing Seo was merely a means to entice. Once the tactician was indebted to him for his existence, infiltrating the gang became effortless. Revisit the orientation. When Lee Sanjian inquired about his method of infiltration, Ma's response was quintessential. Just thrash him thoroughly, isn't it? The utterance barely left his lips when Lee doused him with a glass of spirits straight in his visage. Lee shouted at him, "This is an inquiry, not a public altercation. It's nearly 1994. Officers ought to employ their intellect. From this point forward, you're no longer a policeman. You're a Huang Gang enforcer." Subsequently, Lee delineated the organizational structure. Zhou Tis occupied the apex, succeeded by 5 tiers: advisor, deputy, chief, operations leader, and team members. Ma's objective was to become Zhou's trusted advisor. He didn't aspire to be the deputy. Being the action leader sufficed. Commanders constituted the elite echelon. They possessed knowledge of concealed secrets. Lee's strategy leveraged the obligation from rescuing Seo as a valuable opportunity. Ma would harness that energy, ascending until he positioned himself as a leader, near enough to Zhou to secure his victory once and for all. Naturally, Ma proposed a more straightforward solution. Why not eliminate the existing captain and I'll assume his position? Lee dismissed that suggestion immediately. A genuine organization such as the Huang Gang honors hierarchy. Such a reckless maneuver would never be tolerated. If he desired the position, he needed to adhere to the guidelines and cultivate resilience. For a change, Muzapto truly remained quiet. Observing the tenacious expression on his countenance, Li Sanyang inquired once more, "Did you genuinely listen to me?" Ma promptly affirmed with a nod. Li remained doubtful, yet the decision had been made. From this point forward, Officer Muzapto ceased to exist, supplanted by Muzapto the criminal. Returning to the current moment, Muzapto sat motionlessly in the dormitory, absorbing the misguided instruction of someone on the proper etiquette for addressing a superior. He was on the verge of insanity due to monotony, yet to fulfill the role of a courteous novice, he had to remain seated and endure it. This was the Huang Gang dormitory, essentially a lair for aspiring delinquents. Rumor had it that you needed to endure this excruciating training merely to gain an opportunity. Hierarchy in the dormitory was rigidly determined by seniority. Ma was the most recent arrival, placing him at rank 4 as the household scapegoat. The pair squabbling over the television were the second-ranked individuals, Weasel and Mantu, and the individual presently shouting in Ma's face was Pai Yu, ranked 3. Ma found himself in a difficult situation as he had fabricated a story about experiencing a stomachache and was unable to cry out loud enough. Supervisor, Pai Yu seized the opportunity to give him a severe reprimand. Ma was seething. "I was recruited for this, and now I'm being scolded by this inept individual." When Pai Yu ultimately ceased his shouting and hurled a pamphlet at Ma. The guidelines: commit every word to memory. Ma's gaze brightened. At last, the crucial proof he required had serendipitously presented itself. He swiftly concealed the pamphlet. When Pai Yu appeared perplexed, Ma dismissed it casually. "I simply hold the gang's regulations in high regard, you understand?" Pai Yu, being foolish, purchased it and instructed him to recite it. A test was scheduled for later. Comply with elders without hesitation. Devote yourself to the group. Fidelity takes precedence over everything. Upon reading this nonsense, Ma felt an urge to chuckle. A group of murderers and robbers discussing professional morals. They ought to have begun with understanding the legalities. However, Pai Yu failed to perceive the grin. He was far too intoxicated by the influence of being referred to as senior. Subsequently, Ma posed a query that confounded Pai Yu. "So when do I assume the role of an action leader?" Pai Yu chuckled at him. "Captain, youngster, you'll be fortunate if you manage to achieve full-time status at all. Listen, we're all merely apprentices here, at the lowest rung. Even those two over yonder at the television are merely apprentices." There was merely one individual in the space who truly counted. He was presently slumbering in the rear chamber. His role? Transforming these heaps of refuse into genuine mobsters. It was only upon achieving full membership that Ma could even contemplate assuming the role of captain. Ma inquired further, "How long does that require?" Pai Yu raised 2 fingers, indicating a minimum of 2 years. That figure struck Ma like a sledgehammer. He had no desire to squander 2 years in this place with these misfits. At that moment, Weasel at the television erupted. He whirled around and struck the back of Pai Yu's head with a resounding crack. He admonished Pai Yu to be quiet and cease his posturing simply because a newcomer had arrived. Dissatisfied, he hurled Pai Yu to the ground and commenced trampling on his back. After disparaging Pai Yu, Weasel shifted his frosty gaze toward Ma. "Your superior is being assaulted and you're merely observing?" Suddenly, he reared back and delivered a blow directly to Ma's abdomen. However, an instant later, Weasel understood that something was amiss. Ma's expression? It was frightful. Ma was gripping his fury with white-knuckled intensity. He nearly overturned the table, threatening to send everyone present to the ICU in that very moment. At last, he forced the words out between his clenched jaws. "My stomach? I found myself utterly incapable incapable of responding. The commotion ultimately summoned the genuine article from the rear chamber. He forcefully swung the door ajar and bellowed, "What on earth is happening out here?" The yell was so deafening that Weasel accidentally dropped his cigarette onto his own foot. The assembly jolted to attention as if they had been shocked, inclining in harmony. The man cast a lethal glare at them. "Did I inquire if you were all right? Do you wish to perish?" This was the enforcer in command, Dharma. The scene transitions to Chairman Zhang of the youth organization, leisurely indulging in a round of golf. In his wake, a throng of flatterers mimics each gesture with insincere praise. Furthermore, the mastermind of the spectacle is none other than Zhou Tci, the chief of the Huang gang. Zhang proposes a sports club for him to participate in, but Zhou dismisses the idea with a chuckle, stating that he isn't sufficiently mature for competitive athletics at that level. Zhang remains unfazed. "If you're not engaged in the game, please retrieve my ball." Zhou remains silent. He merely offers a discreet nod to his deputy. But here's the surprise. What they retrieve isn't a golf ball, it's a person. The unfortunate soul is immobilized on the ground by the enforcer, struggling for breath like a fish stranded on land. Chairman Zhang lifts his club, preparing as though he intends to launch it 300 yards straight through the man's cranium. He halts the tip of the club a mere inch from Director Yao's visage. "I seek an explanation." "Yao," Zhang murmurs. "What gave you the audacity to misappropriate 300 million won? With that amount, you could have acquired 2 opulent condominiums in Gangnam." The adhesive strip is yanked away from Yao's lips with a fierce tug. He immediately begins sobbing, pleading for one final opportunity. Zhang gestures for silence by placing a finger to his mouth. "Hush," he prefers not to listen to that nonsense. He seeks the reason. What led this timid individual to believe he could pilfer from a tiger? Following. Upon hearing Yao's faltering explanation, Zhang erupts into an exuberant laugh. "Oh Yao, you are quite the romantic. Pillaging for your spouse's healthcare expenses? I am nearly brought to tears. Since you are such a champion, let's resolve this like gentlemen, with our fists." Basic guidelines. If Yao's hand strikes Zhang even a single time, the deceased has been erased. Zhang even assures that he will personally handle the medical expenses. "I've recently taken an interest in boxing and required a punching bag. What do you think, Yao? Sounds like a fair agreement, doesn't it?" Catching a glimpse of optimism, Yao hastily rises and consents. He believes Zhang is merely a 60-year-old individual. A futile attempt is preferable to inevitable demise. He invests all his effort into a frenzied swing. However, an instant later, a jaw-shattering strike collides with his chin. It is at that moment Yao comprehends that each time Zhang shifts, the enforcer trailing him delivers the actual blow in flawless harmony. Zhang faces Zhou with a smile. "Was my technique satisfactory? This gadget of yours is remarkably useful." Yao is devoid of the strength to plead. A relentless onslaught of powerful blows descends, each one intended to annihilate. Zhang chuckles maniacally with each strike, boasting that he could have secured Olympic gold had he been a decade younger. It doesn't require much time for Yao to crumple into a pile of shattered flesh. However, it's far from finished. Zhang kneels, his tone laced with eerie pleasure. "Taking from me comes at a steep price. Let's engage in a guessing game. If I tighten my hand into a fist, the entire lengthy crew strikes alongside me. However, if I elevate a golf club, what do you suppose those maniacs will grasp? Aren't you at least slightly intrigued?" Following. Ultimately, there is merely a single golf club present in this location. Upon returning to the residence hall, Man 2 and Weasel find themselves bound together, with a pair of undergarments draped over their heads in complete disgrace. Dharma is yelling in their faces. The cause? Laundry. "I mentioned that I enjoy the fragrance of strawberries, didn't I? You opted for blueberries instead. Are you attempting to provoke a disastrous outcome?" The pair plead for their existence, vowing to cleanse it once more. Abruptly, Dharma extends a hand in front of Weasel. Before Weasel is capable of interpreting the signal, strike. A resounding impact propels him into a rotation. Dharma subsequently delivers a backhand that rapidly inflates the opposite side of his visage. Then arrives the genuine terror, an unyielding onslaught of machine gun fire. Masato observed the unfolding event in silence, utterly at a loss for words. While Dharma was occupied reprimanding Man 2 and Weasel, Ma registered a mental reminder. Strawberry-fragranced fabric conditioner. Internally, he assessed his ascent to the pinnacle. Ultimately, Dharma calmed and observed Masato. Upon discovering he was the latest addition, Dharma extended his hand, palm facing upward. He shouted, "What are you lingering there for? Come over here." Ma became immobile, contemplating that the man intended to resolve matters through a confrontation. He sought to avoid complications from the very start. However, if the supervisor was summoning him, he had no choice but to respond. However, as Ma advanced, Dharma surged forward and seized him directly in the groin. The abrupt blow caught Ma entirely off guard. The spark disappeared from his gaze. As Dharma constricted the hold, Ma's visage contorted into an expression of sheer torment. He never anticipated his sole vulnerability to be struck with such exacting accuracy. Observing the others grinning, Ma's fury surged to a crescendo. He had restrained the impulse to eliminate them, all for that position of captain. Was he genuinely expected to endure this degradation for 2 years without retaliating? At that moment, an idea sparked. He need not endure a 2-year wait. Beneath, Dharma's bewildered stare prompted Masakuto to genuinely grin. He had discovered a solution. Weasel and Montu jested that he was relishing the agony. Dharma clenched even tighter solely to be annoying. Even a creature like Ma was unable to endure such agony. His legs gave way instantly, yet he was aware that it wasn't a duration he needed to withstand and anticipate the ideal opportunity. Later that evening, Payu was outdoors awaiting Ma's return with the strawberry-scented fabric conditioner. Noticing Ma positioned nearby, Payu gestured for him to approach and offered him a treat. He clarified that he had preserved it for a difficult time, but chose to disclose it after witnessing what Ma endured. He instructed Ma to consume it discreetly, lest the upperclassmen would thrash them both. He claimed he comprehended the sensation of being at the lowest point. He had experienced it himself. Before Ma had the chance to utter a word, Payu commenced divulging his life narrative. He possessed 3 younger siblings. Their guardians abandoned them during their middle school years. They had been fending for themselves for several years. He was merely 19. Ma recognized that the youth was, in fact, a secondary school pupil who was providing for his entire household. He distributed newspapers at sunrise for mere sense solely to sustain them. However, calamity ensued. 2 intruders invaded his residence and brandished knives at his sister's neck. Payu sensed his blood pressure soar. As he dashed inside, he was immobilized by terror. He was merely a child. In the depths of his anguish, champions emerged and pummeled the intruders mercilessly. The paradox? Those champions were mobsters. Indeed, the individuals who rose to halt this catastrophe were, in fact, criminals. Payu's locality was rife with robbers, yet it was also teeming with criminals. On that day, when the deafening sound erupted within the residence, nearby gang affiliates perceived it and hurried over without delay. From that instant forward, even if society labeled them as refuse, in Payu's perspective, they were the genuine champions who rescued him and his siblings. At that moment, he couldn't even spare a moment to express his gratitude before they disappeared. Their rapid departure only intensified the impression that they resembled the legendary roving champions. From that moment forward, Payu was resolute in emulating their example, setting out on his so-called journey of gallantry. Masakuto paid attention, yet his inner thoughts told a contrasting tale. To him, the youth was misguided, idealizing a group of degenerates. In essence, these ruffians were merely generating rubbish. Compensate, continued urging Ma to persevere, asserting that regardless of how challenging life becomes, one must endure. He insisted that once he attained a senior position, Ma would be pleased that he remained. He even smiled broadly and said to Ma, "Believe in me, kid, just adhere to my guidance and you'll be enjoying the good life." Masakuto had no alternative but to comply, relinquishing another half-hearted superior to maintain the facade. Their intimate conversation was disrupted by the arrival of the meal delivery. Payu instructed Ma to fetch the meal while he entered to arrange the table. Certainly, Payu's history was sorrowful, but Ma's tale of woe did not alter the reality. A criminal is a criminal, end of discussion. However, as soon as Ma received the package, the driver nonchalantly shouted out his true name. Ma examined the situation more intently. Astonishing, the courier was Lee Sanyong. Observing Ma securely within the group, Lee exhaled a profound breath of relief. Ma was perplexed, inquiring whether Lee had infiltrated a Chinese eatery. Lee clumsily clarified that he was merely employed part-time at a convenient gathering location. He subsequently acknowledged that his forecast was inaccurate. He believed that enrolling in such a program would grant Ma an immediate advancement. However, witnessing Ma in those intern garments made it evident that Saw had no desire to allow him to bypass the queue. Nonetheless, he was assigned a fresh task. There's a complete resident in the dormitory known as Dharma. Appears to resemble a large, irate figurine. Ma's subsequent position propelled Dharma into a leadership role. Ma sought to stir the pot in order to ascend further up the ranks. Lee cautioned him consistently, avoid being a martyr. Proceed gradually. Don't jeopardize the entire investigation due to a moment of anger. Ma's hairstyle distinctly disregarded every utterance. His thoughts were already whirling about how to advance Dharma. Prior to departing, Lee mentioned one final point. Be cautious of the action leaders. The Wang Gang is a distinguished team. Those leaders are formidable. Ma couldn't risk antagonizing them. Ma was indifferent. To him, they were merely low-level miscreants. If they overstepped their bounds, he'd simply crush them and proceed. He didn't even have the chance to complete meet his affront before Lee interrupted him, cautioning that he would meet his demise if he attempted such a thing. Keep this in mind. Those individuals are the genuine article. Toward Huang Gang's domain. Consequently, Sunny Out is berating his subordinates, saliva spraying in all directions. He bellowed at them, insisting on discovering which squad was so inept that they were unable to manage even a straightforward collection. A man lifted his hand and expressed his regrets. However, Shio would not tolerate it. He struck the individual fiercely, inquiring if he still wished to remain in the faction. Errors are settled with blood. That ignited the man's temper. He was on the verge of unleashing a curse, and Shio's expression grew frigidly pale. The man stood his ground. He retorted immediately, "Do you believe wealth materializes effortlessly? Everyone is leveraging the predicament as a justification. They are financially strained. What am I meant to do?" He derided in such a manner. Only the individuals on the ground comprehend how chaotic it truly is. A desk worker like you is completely oblivious to the truth of the situation. Confronted with Shio's menaces, the man appeared repulsed. To him, Shio was merely an office clerk who stumbled upon a degree. Being compelled to refer to him as superior made him feel nauseated. Just as the man instructed Shio to cease speaking and resolve the matter through violence, a jeep suddenly surged into view. In the following moment, the automobile crashed directly into the individual, the dreadful power propelling him through the atmosphere and crashing him into a freight container. Before anyone had the chance to respond, the jeep surged ahead like a hunter, smashing him with such force that blood erupted from his mouth immediately. The jeep abruptly shifted into reverse and crushed the man repeatedly, mercilessly treating him like mere refuse on the highway. Shio-sun, Yup observed the horrific spectacle transpire, his limbs growing heavy as iron, anchoring him in place. When he ultimately summoned the bravery to approach nearer, with only a vast, nauseating puddle of blood remaining. Only at that moment did the chauffeur gradually unlock the door and exit. It was none other than the Huang Gang's additional heavyweight, action leader Cho Wan-pil. Observing the devastation, Cho grinned and quipped, "Well, since it's already stained with blood, perhaps I should simply coat the entire vehicle in crimson." Shio gulped nervously and managed to stutter. If you were on your way, you could have at least provided a warning." Cho directed a frigid stare at him. "A warning? Not my approach. Cease your hand gestures and return to fiddling with your calculator." He slammed his boot forcefully into the crimson splatter on the earth, erupting in a barrage of ferocious invectives and strikes. Shio observed the frenzied canine in motion, too petrified to even exhale. After Cho had expressed his fury, he nonchalantly instructed Shio to examine the deceased individual's insurance policy. Inform them that it was a hit-and-run incident. Rectify the situation. He then surveyed his surroundings and established the rules. "In my view, today is null and void. Provided that no one interferes with my finances, I remain indifferent. However, if anyone lays a hand on my money, even if it's a police officer, I will eliminate them." In the interim, at the residence hall, the atmosphere was entirely distinct. Masakuto was engaged in an intense head-down plank. Dharma was strolling with a hefty wooden staff, administering physical discipline to the trainees. The motive behind this torment? It resembled a jest. Someone had requested fried rice in lieu of the customary black bean noodles. As no one was admitting guilt, Dharma proceeded along the row, striking each individual with the stick as a cautionary measure. The true offender, Masakuto, was perspiring and cursing within. All this commotion over a dish of fried rice? How petty can one be? Dharma wasn't foolish. He was acutely aware that the newcomer was the one responsible. But abruptly, Pai lifted his gaze and shouted, "It was me!" Ma froze. He was astonished that this youngster was genuinely taking the blame for him. Dharma promptly utilized it as an instructional opportunity. "Observe, this is the reason we uphold discipline. In the realm of shadows, demise is perpetually imminent. The collective must function as a cohesive unit. If even a single individual acts independently, the entire crew disintegrates. That's why we require you to..." In Dharma's perspective, Pai's misconduct posed a danger to the gang's fundamental structure. Thus, he swung the rod, striking it forcefully against Pai's back repeatedly. Mafrond, he was unable to comprehend it. What was Pai gaining from this? Why would he go to such lengths for him? Before long, Pai's visage was a battered, inflamed disaster, blood flowing continuously from his nostrils. Nonetheless, the tenacious blaze in his gaze remained undiminished. He even produced a feeble smile, as if conveying to Ma, "I assured you I'd keep an eye on you." Cursing himself internally, "You fool. Focus on your own safety before attempting to shield me." Enraged that Pai refused to yield, Dharma forcefully struck him to the ground. Securing him with a knee pressed against his back, Dharma elevated the sturdy wooden club high, targeting a fatal blow directly at Pai's head. Observing this, Pai fervently expressed remorse and implored for clemency. urgency. At that pivotal instant, Masako could no longer endure the situation. He seized Dharma's arm, abruptly halting the absurdity. Was the individual who requested the fried rice, so let's conclude it there. Sneaky. And Mantu, positioned behind them, never anticipated him possessing such formidable strength. Dharma angrily inquired whether he had any comprehension of his actions. This constituted insubordination. He was the sole full member present and the only individual capable of facilitating their advancement. Masako appeared utterly unperturbed. Advancement? I can accomplish that without your assistance. The instant those words escaped his lips, he seized a bowl of black bean noodles and forcefully thrust it into Dharma's visage. The immense power propelled Dharma directly to the earth. That singular maneuver utterly astonished the remaining two. By remarkable. Initially, Masako gained the advantage in a sunshi. In his perspective, if he was to assume the role of a champion, the bare minimum he could do was seek retribution in this situation. Owing to Pai, he had at last discovered his opportunity to ascend further. Clenching his fists, he instructed Dharma to decide, left or right. As the ultimate countdown echoed, Dharma had a singular thought in his mind: evade to the right. In the following moment, both of Ma's hands struck down simultaneously. The earth appeared to splinter upon the collision. Dharma was unable to evade and was rendered insensible immediately. More rolled. He shifted his shoulders, then glanced at the other two. From this point forward, the nocturnal dining period has commenced and the previous regulations are obsolete. Everyone participates or you risk facing consequences. Pai gazed vacantly at the spectacle, his mind evidently failing to keep pace. Weasel immediately erupted, cautioning Ma not to perceive them as mere random street thugs simply due to his brief presence. This was the Wang gang. Indeed, subsequently, he shouted for Mantu. As Mantu surged from the rear to ensnare Ma in a tight embrace, Weasel lunged forward, fists flailing. However, Ma merely inclined his body downwards. Weasel, whose blow struck directly against Mantu's visage from behind. With a lifeless thump, Mantu fell rigidly to the ground. Even Weasel had not anticipated accidental hostility. Mortified, his fury transformed into another assault as he charged at Ma once more. When simply sidestepped, evading it effortlessly yet again. Weasel secretly grinned, perceiving Ma as a timid individual who solely excelled at evasion. However, Ma's fist obliterated that illusion in an instant. Taking Weasel by surprise, he launched a direct blow straight into his visage. It appeared to be a nonchalant strike, yet it propelled Weasel completely off his feet. And that was merely the simplest maneuver in boxing, a straight punch. At that moment, Dharma stirred from his slumber with a grunt. He furiously yelled at Ma, menacingly proclaiming that once he filed a report, Ma's fate was sealed. Yet Ma remained utterly unfazed. Report what? That a group of seasoned veterans and established members were outmatched by the fresh recruit. You veterans were meant to guide the newcomers, yet ended up getting overwhelmed instead. How will the supervisors react upon discovering this? Furthermore, you are on the verge of attaining full membership status. You wouldn't even consider bringing this to light at this moment. If the authorities discover what transpired here, I won't be the one facing the consequences. It will be you inept failures who will bear the brunt. Therefore, if you wish to avoid gathering your belongings and being ejected, maintain your silence. From this instant forth, the authority in this space has shifted. Once the turmoil subsided, everyone finally settled down and began to dine appropriately. The hierarchy within the residence was entirely rearranged. Weasel dropped to the 4th position. Mantu ascended to the 3rd spot, and Dharma was brought down to the lowest point. The moment he reached for his chopsticks, bam, he was struck directly on the head, merely for neglecting to employ courteous language toward his superior. Mao had now ascended to the top position in the dormitory, while Pai Yu, owing to his prior allegiance, was elevated to the 2nd rank. Seizing Dharma firmly in the groin, Makadli inquired, "What's my subsequent task?" Dharma inhaled sharply in distress, entirely misinterpreting the danger. Wailing in a frenzy, he exclaimed, "Be the leader. You're prepared to embark on assignments." These purported positions, in straightforward terms, involved soliciting extortionate protection fees. The Huang gang managed numerous establishments, and that unsavory task was a regular practice for individuals such as them. Maselko truly didn't anticipate Dharma to be behind the wheel of such a fine vehicle. He playfully remarked that if the car was this impressive, why not sell it rather than extort protection fees? Dharma quickly clarified that the car didn't belong to him. It was leased. That left Ma even more perplexed. If it was leased, wouldn't it be wiser to conserve the rental expenses and instead allocate that money to cover the protection fee? Dharma appeared utterly baffled, questioning whether this individual grasped the principles of gang etiquette at all. He ultimately confessed that the vehicle was lent to him by Tao Wanbeong. That operations captain had a relatively good rapport with him, and had Dharma not borrowed it, he would have been in a dire situation. He felt compelled to do so. Upon learning that the man continued to unflinchingly demand rent from his companion, Ma couldn't shake the suspicion that their bond was truly as strong as Dharma asserted. He found it unnecessary to inquire further. With a sneer, he labeled him a coward and then reminded Dharma that in the real world, Ma held the authority. If anyone exposed their secret, neither of them would make it out unscathed. Before too long, the pair reached their endpoint. Outside, in a store, a Yanthuda elderly woman was positioned by the entrance. Wasakudo inquired, "Is this the location?" Dharma acknowledged with a nod, clarifying that they not only gathered turf charges, but also extortion payments. Furthermore, this residence was already several months in arrears. Dharma hushed his tone and cautioned him that the elderly lady possessed a notably irritable disposition. Observing Dharma's anxious shifting, Ma exhaled in exasperation and resolved to take matters into his own hands. To be honest, he was accustomed to apprehending criminals, not coercing individuals. He had never engaged in anything akin to gathering ransom payments, and merely lingering at the entrance unsettled him. The elderly lady, who initially welcomed them with a friendly grin, was immediately disturbed as soon as she understood the reason for their presence. Masakudo couldn't restrain himself from muttering inwardly. He undoubtedly possessed the visage of an upstanding individual, so why was he compelled to undertake such unscrupulous tasks? Given that it was his inaugural experience undertaking a task of this nature, he assumed he was meant to showcase the collection bag initially, and then haughtily rest his foot on the table. Even, although Ma believed he was abysmal at portraying the role, the overwhelming, oppressive presence he exuded rendered him more reminiscent of a mobster than a genuine criminal. Thus, without requiring many words, he succeeded in gathering every last penny of the funds. Even Masakudo was astonished. In just a brief excursion, he had amassed what equated to 3 months' worth of his police earnings. He found himself unable to resist pondering the nature of reality. Why did everyone simply relinquish their money the moment he entered? Was it truly this effortless to extract funds? For a fleeting moment, a bizarre notion flitted through his mind. Had he been inherently destined to be a criminal? Extortion payments arrived far too swiftly, yet the moment that ensued entirely dismantled that perception. As the elderly woman pivoted, her stooped posture bore an indescribable weight of grief and resignation. The young girl next to her, entirely unaware of the recent events, naively pulled at her mother and inquired what was the matter. An elderly lady struggled to suppress her emotions, compelling a grin as she reassured her daughter that all was well. Yet the tears continued to stream down her cheeks. Observing this from afar, Masakudo lapsed into an extended, profound quietude. The scene shifts. Dharma gazed downward, tallying the substantial bundle of bills in his grasp, beaming broadly. He couldn't refrain from commending Ma's skill in eliminating the delinquent debt all at once. What type of magic did you employ in that situation? However, before he could complete his statement, Masakudo struck the back of his head. With an icy demeanor, Mas cautioned him, "When it's solely the two of us, ensure that you address your superior with respect." Subsequently, Masakudo commanded, "Never involve me in intimidating defenseless civilians again. Do you possess any targets that genuinely present a challenge?" Dharma comprehended instantly. Certainly we do, but those individuals won't simply relinquish the funds willingly. He elucidated that those stores were primarily managed by rival criminals, recommending Ma to focus on less challenging prey. However, Ma instructed him to be quiet and take the lead. Given the effectiveness of his coercive methods, he might as well apply them against some genuine mobsters. Before long, the duo reached their subsequent locale, Youth Karaoke. The proprietor of this establishment was Hwang Chun-sik, a regional ruffian who had relocated to Seoul and succeeded in establishing a reputation for himself. Upon learning the motive behind the visit, Hwang Chun-sik chuckled. "I clawed my way to the summit in Seoul. Who on earth do I require safeguarding from?" "What did Hwang Chun dispatch you with?" Masukdo responded with utmost seriousness. "No." Hwang chuckled even more. "If he didn't dispatch you, then what brings you here? Complimentary giveaways?" At that moment, a set of enormous hands grasped Ma's shoulders. A massive behemoth, even more towering than Ma, scowled and cautioned him against causing any disturbances in this place. There was no forewarning, no build-up. In the following instant, Ma's steely grip plunged into the Titan's visage. It was as if someone pressed the pause button. The savage's gaze rolled upward, and he collapsed rigidly to the ground, immediately incapacitated. Even Hwang Chun-sik was astonished. He had never anticipated that his best performer would be knocked out with a single blow. Ma gradually retracted his fist and gazed at Hwang. "Now, can we at last engage in a meaningful conversation?" Hwang scoffed, deriding Ma for possessing a desire for self-destruction by pursuing his wealth. "You're in a tough spot, kid. All my pals are gathered here today for a reunion. You just stumbled into a battleground." The majority of individuals would have been terrified at the sight of the throng approaching. However, Ma surveyed her surroundings fangs and genuinely grinned. For him, this was ideal. A brawl is only enjoyable when there are sufficient figures to strike. In the meantime, Dharma was nervously strolling back and forth outside the karaoke lounge. Just as he was envisioning the most dreadful scenario, bam! A silhouette burst forth from the entrance. Dharma blinked in astonishment. The individual rolling on the sidewalk was none other than Huang Chunsik himself. Before Dharma could fully comprehend it, Ma nonchalantly ambled through the doorway. In his grasp, he clutched an absurdly incongruous shrimp cracker bag, which was bulging with hefty bundles of currency. Dharma's jaw dropped in astonishment. He couldn't fathom how Ma accomplished it. However, Ma breezed by him, casually remarking, "I have a task to attend to," and continued on her way. The scene shifts back to the brief glimpse from before. The elderly woman was cleansing tables, still sorrowful over the hard-won money that was stolen from her. While she labored, tears quietly coursed down her lined visage. Abruptly, her daughter shouted for her. The elderly woman pivoted and became still. Her young daughter was grasping the identical shrimp chip packet that mother had acquired earlier. The elderly woman became frantic, inquiring about its origin. The girl, with naivety, responded, "That uncle from before bestowed it upon me." The elderly lady was astounded. What astonished her even more was that the pouch held significantly more cash than she had relinquished. The young girl beamed radiantly. "That uncle is distinct. He claimed he isn't a criminal. He's a champion." Upon returning to the dormitory, Ma was nonchalantly consuming her meal while keeping a firm grip on Dharma's groin. Dharma, weeping in distress, pleaded with him, "Chief, kindly inform me, where did you stash the cash we gathered from that store?" Ma obstinately responded, "I informed you, I misplaced it." Dharma was utterly distressed. That sum needed to be delivered to Action Captain Chow One Pill today. Upon hearing the name, Ma recalled the obnoxious individual who rented the vehicle. He lifted an eyebrow. Is that person genuinely that intimidating? Dharma turned ashen. It's not about inducing fear. The individual is a sociopath. Anyone who interferes with his finances meets a grim fate. He shows no concern, even if you're in law enforcement. Only a short while ago, he assaulted a complete member, sending him to the intensive care unit because the individual was lacking in his contributions. To Dharma, Chow epitomized the quintessential avaricious lunatic and represented the most perilous variety of stingy individual. Ma was still pondering whether Dharma was merely embellishing the truth. Abruptly, a loud, piercing inhalation resonated from the staircase. Suddenly, a deafening shout erupted from below, causing Dharma to startle. "Hurry up and come down here immediately." That deafening bellow emanating from below immediately frayed the composure of all the residents in the dormitory. Even Dharma, who had been acting tough moments earlier, began to perspire profusely. Masakuto was still pondering who on earth had just shown up, but Dharma was already so frightened he was nearly wetting himself. Due to the delayed tribute, Action Captain Chow One Pill had arrived in person. When Chow entered the chamber and was welcomed by an exceedingly pitiful dramatic display, Dharma was staging a performance, vehemently yelling at his team, insisting to find out who misappropriated the gathered funds. Upon completing his brief performance, Dharma feigned to suddenly notice Chow. Sporting a simulated grin, he hurried over. "Young, what brings you all the way down here? I was just about to reach out to you." Internally rolled his eyes. "This is what you referred to by saying I'll manage it? Only a fool would fall for such poor performance." Dharma maintained a lowered gaze, expressing remorse and embracing the consequences, grasping onto a fragment of optimism. "We've been acquainted for numerous years. Surely he will show me some leniency." Yet, in the immediate following moment, without any indication, Chow seized a bottle of alcohol and violently shattered it against Dharma's skull. With a nauseating crash, shards of glass and crimson splattered throughout the chamber. Dharma shrieked and fell to the ground. Before Dharma could even regain his composure, Chow pounced on him like a beast of prey. Chow secured Dharma's head in place with one hand while using the other to direct the sharp, fractured neck of the bottle directly at Dharma's eye. In the distorted reasoning of Chow One Pill, "If you puncture my monetary gathering, I'll puncture your eye." As he observed the jagged shard of glass creeping perilously close to his iris, Dharma's determination utterly crumbled. He parted his lips to betray Ma. The funds were his. It was the novice who was at fault. However, before he could complete the statement, a massive hand surged forward and seized the shattered glass in its unprotected grasp. It was Ma Sayakdu. With icy eyes, he spoke steadily. "That's sufficient," the child aired. "Are you attempting to end his life over it? Given that the issue is already present, addressing the shortfall is what is important. Eliminating him won't retrieve your funds. Grant us a couple of days, and I will personally settle the obligation." Eavesdropping from a distance, Dharma swallowed hard, contemplating that Ma was courting disaster by addressing Chow in such a manner. And indeed, the next target of violence was Ma. Chow landed a forceful blow directly to his face. Chow transformed into a ferocious ferocious creature, delivering a relentless onslaught of powerful strikes upon Ma Sayokdu. Amazingly, Ma merely remained in place, enduring each harsh blow without making any attempt to retaliate. Upon concluding his attack, Chow flicked the blood from his knuckles and abruptly tilted his head back in thunderous laughter. I've been involved in this field for quite some time. I never misinterpret individuals. You can discern precisely what a man is worth merely by gazing into his eyes. You're the child that Sanyap introduced, am I correct? Where on earth did he discover you? Your gaze? It nearly shouts, I can generate substantial profit for you. In an excellent spirit now, Chow announced he would overlook the financial matter. In return, Ma and his team were assuming control of a new enterprise. The task that Chow assigned to them was an unlawful pre-owned vehicle leasing scheme. The scheme was straightforward. Acquire high-end vehicles for extended periods in large quantities, then illicitly lease them out on a short-term basis to casual customers, reaping the substantial profit margin. The weekly charge amounted to 500,000 won, slightly exceeding 2,000 renminbi. In the realm of leasing, it was sheer daylight theft. However, the astonishing aspect was that the appetite for the fraud was exceptionally high. Ma's role was merely to deliver the vehicles and retrieve them afterward. Their patrons consisted solely of nightlife enthusiasts and insecure individuals fixated on showcasing affluence they did not possess. Outside the vehicle, 3 of those precise posturing individuals were encircling Payu, irritatingly insisting on a discount of 100,000 won. Observing, Payu was merely a child on their own, revealing their genuine nature by swearing and insisting on the keys. It's an unlawful lease regardless. You can't approach the authorities, simply reduce the price already. Masakuto remained within the vehicle, silently attuned to the sound of the dogs yapping beyond. He gazed at the weighty bundle of automobile keys in his grasp, his expression deepening as he contemplated for a moment. Outside, the chief bully was still boasting audibly about his prominence in the Gangnam district. He didn't even manage to conclude his statement before his expression twisted into a visage of abrupt, intense suffering. Bang! Masakuto thrust his fist forcefully through the automobile window and propelled the hefty keys through the opening, striking the thug like a projectile. The assailant howled and was propelled backward, landing with such clumsiness that it appeared as though he had just received a devastating, underhanded blow directly to the spine. Ma casually swung the door ajar and emerged. He fixed his gaze on the last 2. So, do you intend to settle the payment and lease the vehicle now? Or would you prefer to get your behinds kicked and then weep while you secure it? Oh, and the shattered window? That's an additional charge. The greater the duration Ma devoted to managing this type of refuse, the less his moral compass as a law enforcement officer troubled him. The patronage resembled a spectacle of oddities, low-level ruffians leasing opulent vehicles to project an image of authority in the presence of their henchmen. Shady corporate executives leasing ostentatious vehicles to bring companions to karaoke lounges, and complete despicable opportunists who utilized vehicles to approach and exploit unsuspecting young women at nightclubs. In the meantime, the seasoned hustler Dharma was discreetly beckoning Weasel to the side, inquiring if he wished to earn some unreported cash. They concurred to surreptitiously raise the rental fee by 50,000 won and keep the surplus. Weasel's eyes gleamed with avarice as he enthusiastically nodded. Indeed, when the subsequent client encountered an abrupt increase in cost, the gentleman scowled and expressed his discontent. What sort of company abruptly increases the cost without warning? Dharma suspected the fellow was attempting to evade the payment. He rolled up his sleeves, prepared to summon Montu to impart a lesson. However, to his astonishment, the man refrained from contesting and simply handed over the money. Dharma was utterly astonished. He had never anticipated that the individual would settle the amount so readily. When Dharma glanced down, he recognized that the man had compensated entirely with large denomination notes. It became evident that among all their clientele, the most benevolent were the affluent youths from Apgujeong. In straightforward terms, these pampered, second-generation progeny from Seoul's most opulent neighborhood thrived on their parents' wealth and indulged in nightly revelries. These affluent youths utilized the service incessantly, allowing them to showcase a distinct opulent vehicle at the club each week. They were, without question, the most lucrative cash generators. Moments swiftly passed, and before long, twilight settled in. Masato and Payu were stationed beneath a hidden overpass, enjoying a brief respite. Ma casually inquired about the remaining quota. Payu consulted the records and remarked that there was just 1 delivery left. Upon hearing that, Ma chose to take a brief rest and instructed Payu to rouse him in 10 minutes. He extended his hand towards the mechanism to adjust his chair, aspiring to find ease. However, at that moment, an odd and eerie noise shattered the tranquility within the vehicle. Masato glanced downward and recognized that his hand had not seized the lever. Instead, his fingers were ensnared around something extraordinarily peculiar. Concurrently, across Across the city, Cho Won-pil was being halted by one of his subordinates, who confessed he still harbored reservations about dispatching Dharma and the others. Certainly, those fools were adept at extracting payments from individuals, but was it not excessively perilous to assign them that task? Cho Won-pil retorted with an inquiry of his own. When you refer to dangerous, are you implying perilous for me or perilous for Dharma's faction? The junior responded softly that it posed a peril for both parties, particularly if news ever got to Joe TCI. Should that occur, everyone's position would be jeopardized. That was precisely why only the two of them were aware of this matter from the outset. Consequently, it became even more crucial to sever ties decisively before those fools ever had the opportunity to jeopardize their own stability. In Cho Won-pil's perspective, the funds amassed by those individuals were merely trivial amounts. However, for Dharma's team, it was sufficient to drive them to toil relentlessly. Allowing them to undertake such a perilous and unsavory task was ideal. Should any complications arise, he merely needed to sever the connection and move on. With that said, Cho Won-pil gradually exhaled and began to murmur about their supervisor, Cho TCI, remarking that the jerk was incomprehensible. Why overlook something this remarkable? Simultaneously, Masakuto gazed at his discovery and became motionless, as he had ultimately come to understand that Cho Won-pil was utterly unhinged. At first glance, it appeared to be a vehicle rental enterprise, yet beneath the facade, it was a front for drug trafficking. And at that moment, everything fell into place, and he finally grasped why that so-called leasing enterprise was flourishing so significantly. The affluent youth in Apgujeong were not perpetually exchanging high-end vehicles merely to flaunt their wealth. They were utilizing the leasing service as a facade for illicit drug transactions. And those affluent second-generation spoiled youngsters swapping luxury vehicles weekly were the true customers driving the demand, which implied that each occasion Masakuto had been providing rental vehicles, he had simultaneously been transporting narcotics without even realizing it. If Lee Sanyong were to discover this, Masakuto would be doomed. Therefore, before that could transpire, he needed to eliminate Cho Won-pil personally. Upon that contemplation, he promptly inquired of Pai Yu regarding Dharma's whereabouts. Pai Yu replied that Dharma was engaged in a transaction and was unavailable. However, the instant Masakuto learned that Dharma's distribution area was Apgujeong, his spirits plummeted. This indicated that the fool likely remained oblivious to the fact that he was ferrying illicit substances. By the moment the pair ultimately discovered Dharma's vehicle, darkness had entirely descended. Masakuto forcefully pulled open the rear door and beheld Dharma within, so brutally assaulted that his visage was unrecognizable due to severe swelling. He promptly inquired about what was occurring, but Dharma lingered in indecision for an extended period before eventually uttering 3 words: Poppy Gang. The moment he heard that name, Masakuto abruptly understood that he was encircled on all fronts by a multitude of subordinates. Then a figure emerged from the throng and ridiculed him, asserting that even criminals should possess some fundamental professional principles. How could they dare to infringe upon the livelihoods of individuals already entrenched in the drug trade? The individual was none other than the operations team leader of the Poppy Gang, Shin Sang-lee. With a contemptuous grin, he inquired whether they were under the influence or merely neglectful of their medication. Furthermore, if their stomachs were still vacant, perhaps they ought to consume something before perishing. How about a knife meal? The scene subsequently transitioned back to Chow Pil, who was elucidating Poppy Gang to his junior associate. Their primary operation revolved around narcotics trafficking, and if they discovered that anyone was interfering with that enterprise in their territory, they would not allow it to slide. Furthermore, once the circumstances escalated, the information would ultimately arrive at Poppy Gang's leader. Subsequently, even Joe TCI would become aware of it. At that point, Chow Pil could effortlessly assert that Dharma and the others had acted independently. The underling swiftly grasped the implication of those remarks, so he intended to cast Dharma and the others aside as fall guys. Chow Pil responded without delay. Naturally, if he continued to shield them, Joe TCI would ultimately discover that he too had participated in narcotic smuggling. He had already extracted ample benefit from Dharma's faction. This was the ideal moment to sever the connection. Moreover, he was not required to carry out the slicing personally. The Poppy Gang would handle that for him. At best, he could permit them to depart with a small portion of the merchandise as compensation for their efforts. Additionally, at that moment, confronted by the adversaries encircling him, Masukdo ultimately grasped the entire plot. Having utilized them to their utmost extent, Chow Pil was now strategizing to eliminate them with the assistance of Poppy Gang the instant there was a possibility of the issue escalating to those in higher authority. At that moment, Masukdo's gaze became frigid. That deranged Chow Pil had truly involved a law enforcement officer from the Republic of Korea in such a situation, and he gradually tightened his hand into a fist, fixated on a singular notion. promotion. He intended to eliminate that scoundrel personally. Just moments earlier, Masukdo found himself encircled by the entire Poppy gang, yet he remained completely composed. He effortlessly removed his belt, coiled it around his hand, tightened his fist, and prepared to genuinely flex his strength. The initial brute lunged forward, bringing a bat crashing down upon him. However, Masukdo slightly flexed his knees and delivered a direct blow straight into the man's abdomen. And before he had the opportunity to retract his fist, another individual was already charging forward with a blade. Masukdo pivoted his body away, seizing the man's arm in one fluid motion, and flung him forcefully against the vehicle's window next to them. Before he could completely pivot, the third assailant was already in his vicinity. Masukdo nonchalantly seized a book and struck it directly against the man's head. In the following instant, a blade glimmered icily through the atmosphere as another ruffian lunged toward his throat with a dagger. The knife was on the verge of making contact with skin when Masukdo swiftly raised his hand. The belt coiled around his fist, just managing to halt the blow with determination. As the man retracted the knife and swiftly sliced again from the flank, Masukdo bent his body backward in a pronounced, nearly comically elegant arc and narrowly evaded it. He even had the extra breath to caution the individual that according to Article 70 of the Firearms Explosives and Blades Control Act, possessing a blade without authorization could result in a maximum of 10 years of incarceration. The instant he uttered it, the hand encased in that strap descended forcefully onto the edge, and the power was so tremendous that it propelled the blade directly into the vehicle's frame. As the other individual continued to futilely attempt to pull it free, Masukdo seized him by the head and crashed it violently against the flank of the automobile. The collision was dreadful. The man's visage was nearly imprinted into the metal, resulting in a profound, distinct indentation. Observing this, Shinsengui instantly bellowed for all his subordinates to charge him simultaneously. In response, 3 followers advanced in unison, darting directly toward Masukdo. However, Masukdo flung the car door ajar to obstruct their path. He then propelled himself forward with the might of a stampeding bull, hurling all 3 individuals backwards with a solitary shoulder strike. The impact even contorted the car door beyond recognition. As Masukdo boldly called out for the subsequent one to arrive, before he could complete his statement, 2 arms unexpectedly encircled him from the rear. It became evident that the ruffian who had vanished previously had maneuvered around him and ensnared him securely. The rest swiftly converged, seizing the opportunity to immobilize him right where he stood. Then, one of them lifted a hatchet high and swung it down toward Masukdo's skull. However, at the final moment, a silhouette soared in. Dharma's airborne strike propelled that individual away. Before Masukdo could fully comprehend the situation, Dharma had already touched down smoothly and thrown out a line. "Fear not, I hold a grievance as well." Regarding the sudden appearance of Dharma, that was due to Payu. Amidst the turmoil, he had successfully liberated everyone, and now it was time for those scoundrels to face the consequences. The individuals who had been battling each other mere moments prior were now more cohesive than ever. It was only in this instant that the principle inscribed in their doctrine truly disclosed its genuine significance. No verbal communication, nor even a glance, was necessary. Confronting the Poppy crew, the quartet advanced simultaneously and positioned themselves at the forefront, protecting Masukdo behind their ranks. Beginning with Dharma, the individual was typically the archetypal coward, who intimidated the vulnerable and dreaded the powerful, groveling and fawning before those in authority while asserting his dominance over newcomers. And still, a person of that nature had been the initial one to leap forward and shield him with a weapon. Beneath the surface, Masukdo couldn't resist pondering what sort of individual Dharma truly was. As per the narrative, when Dharma selected lots during his childhood, he chose a hammer, and his parents had previously envisioned him maturing into a skilled craftsman. But a man's existence is not determined by his progenitors. That tool never resulted in constructing barriers. Instead, it transformed into the instrument he wielded to strike others, and the manner in which he swung it resembled Daruma striking a wooden fish. Consequently, over the years, Dharma transformed into the moniker that endured. Then, there stood Weasel. If Dharma embodied the sort of thug who communicated solely through physical aggression, then Weasel represented an entirely distinct species. He was lanky yet sinewy, inherently ferocious and shadowy within, and no one ever referred to him as if he were a formidable force. However, all those who had battled him consistently expressed the same sentiment. No one wished to confront that scoundrel, as he persistently exploited vulnerabilities and engaged in unscrupulous tactics, imposing like a hunter concealed in the shadows. And that was precisely the origin of the name Weasel. Regarding Manto, the individual who appeared somewhat sluggish and lackluster on the exterior, he had previously been the immense promise of the Gyeongsan wrestling arena, an individual recognized as the remarkable newcomer of Halajai. In urban combat where a solitary mistake step could result in death. Why was an individual possessing such deadly prowess referred to as manto? The solution was so uncomplicated that it bordered on absurdity. He simply had a profound affection for consuming steamed buns. Had Dharma and the others truly been feeble from the outset, they would never have qualified to become Huang Gang trainee members in the first place. The sole reason they appeared feeble at this moment was due to the fact that the individual before them, Ma Suk-du, was undeniably excessively powerful. Before long, Shin Sang-li found himself entombed in the soil, with merely his head protruding. Confronted with Ma Suk-du's inquiries, he swiftly attempted to clarify, stating that he truly had no inkling they belonged to Huang Gang. Otherwise, even with 100 times more courage, he would never have had the audacity to interfere. Yet he truly failed to grasp when Huang Gang had begun engaging in narcotics trafficking. According to the information he had received, their leader despised that realm more than anything else. Huang Gang had received Bam Chan Gang's untainted lineage, and if anyone within the organization sullied themselves with such dealings, they faced death. Upon hearing that, even Dharma interjected, expressing that they themselves were completely unaware of what had transpired. They had been ensnared in this narcotics smuggling predicament without fully grasping it, and he compelled Ma Suk-du to escalate the matter without delay. Set aside the Poppy Gang assault for the moment. The narcotics dilemma needed to be resolved first. However, as soon as those words escaped his lips, Ma Suk-du seized him forcefully in the groin and cautioned him quietly to consider his words carefully, with so many individuals eavesdropping. Ma Suk-du comprehended more than anyone else that he wished to expose the entire situation right away. However, if he acted on that impulse at this moment, those who would suffer first would be them. This was unequivocally not the moment for hasty actions, so he instructed everyone present that everything that transpired today, whether involving their faction or the Poppy Gang, should be regarded as if it had never occurred. Upon hearing this, that all individuals present appeared utterly perplexed. However, Ma Suk-du provided no clarification and merely instructed them all to return home. Regardless of whether it was the Poppy faction or Dharma's assembly, no one could ascertain Ma Suk-du's true intentions at that time. Soon enough, the collective made their way back to Huang Gang's headquarters. Dharma advanced and informed Cho One-pil that they had fulfilled today's allocation, then inquired if they could return and take a break. The 5 individuals positioned themselves in a line, anticipating Cho One-pil, who was reclining with an eye mask in place, to utter a word. When Cho One-pil inquired about the situation, while Dharma maintained that absolutely nothing had occurred today, Pai Yu, nonetheless, subtly cast a look at Ma Suk-du beside him. He just couldn't fathom the reason. Ever since the confrontation with the Poppy Gang, boss Ma Suk-du had remained silent. Upon hearing the announcement, Cho One-pil merely gestured with his hand and instructed them to tidy up and return to their rest. However, Ma Suk-du continued to gaze at Cho One-pil with intense agitation in his eyes. Truthfully, what he desired most in that moment was to charge ahead and unleash his fury upon him. Yet rationality ultimately quelled the impulse. Ma Suk-du was acutely aware that acting impulsively now would result in greater detriment than benefit. The sheer force tactic he employed on Dharma would be ineffective against Cho One-pil. A reckless assault on a captain would merely cause Big Boss Cho Tae-sae to lose all confidence in him. Should that occur, dismiss the notion of a promotion. He likely wouldn't even endure within the Hong Gang. Even if he exposed Cho One-pil's narcotics operations there was no indication that Cho Tae-sae would accept the word of a mere novice. If Cho retaliated, Ma Suk-du would undoubtedly be the one shoved into a barrel and cast into the sea. As Ma was immersed in contemplation, a voice broke the stillness in the room. Seo Sang-up appeared unexpectedly. He shot a fierce look at Cho and questioned, "Why on earth are you responding to my calls?" Seo flung a pile of newly printed business cards onto the table. He scoffed, "If we aim to operate a reputable company, the minimum we can do is produce some cards. By the way, I handled the insurance compensation for that fool you hit." Observing from the periphery, Ma silently derided, "It's been ages, Seo. You nearly implored me to participate, and now you've relegated me to the lowest tier as mere manual labor." In spite of Seo's modifications, Cho One-pil, still donning his sleep mask, remained motionless on the sofa, offering not a peep. Seo's gaze fixed on Cho's visage, his demeanor becoming increasingly ominous with each passing moment. The atmosphere in the chamber became frigid. The 2 individuals participated in a wordless confrontation, neither inclined to concede. At last, Seo shattered the quiet to preserve his own reputation. He managed a painfully rigid grin. "Indeed, continue dozing. I'm in charge." However, the moment he turned away, the grin disappeared, as being entirely overlooked in front of the low-ranking members ignited his fury. From the edge of the chamber, Ma Suk-du scrutinized the complete contest for dominance. Seo dashed outside, crouched on the earth, and began to curse vehemently. For a senior executive to be degraded in such a manner was a a significant affront to his dignity. To exacerbate the situation, even his inexpensive lighter appeared to ridicule him, stubbornly failing to ignite regardless of how vigorously he flicked it. At that moment, a hand extended, presenting a lit lighter directly in front of his visage. Click. Ma Suk-do crouched beside him, offering a warm salutation. Inhaling from his cigarette, he exhaled a sigh and began to express his frustrations. Seo endeavored to alleviate tensions. Even Cho Won-pil commended your efforts. Frankly, I regret introducing you merely to initiate you as an apprentice. Exercise patience. I will devise a means to integrate you into my close circle shortly. Navigating the situation flawlessly, Ma offered Seo several flattering remarks, skillfully appeasing the executive's wounded pride. Then, Ma changed direction. He squinted and inquired softly, Seo's youthful Cho Won-pil is truly a nuisance, isn't he? Before Seo could respond, Ma leaned in nearer, lowering his voice to a murmur. I actually possess a strategy that is just as flawless as my visage. What do you think? Would you like me to assist you in turning the Huang gang entirely on its head? The scene transitions. In the meantime, Cho Won-pil lay spread-eagled on an enormous waterbed, recuperating from a hangover. For context, this action leader was recognized on the streets as the Golden Phantom. To him, merely two things in existence held significance: wealth and the remains of anyone who obstructed his path to riches. Before long, he drowsily rose to answer nature's call. The torrent struck the toilet with the intensity of a ferocious cascade. He gazed downward and grinned with contorted satisfaction. Even from this distance, my precision is impeccable. He lifted an eyebrow, contemplating that the day had commenced splendidly. Zipping up and re-entering the room, two provocatively dressed women had already presented him with a steaming bowl of ramen. Without him having to request it, the noodles were prepared to a perfect al dente, precisely to his preference. However, what truly made him feel like the Cho Won today was an unexpected find. There were two pieces of dried seaweed concealed within the ramen packet. Absorbing the melodious, docile laughter of the women beside him, Cho munched on the seaweed. Utterly convinced that today was his fortunate day to strike it rich, he nonchalantly seized the seaweed nearby and swallowed everything in one swift motion. Yet, in the very next instant, he expelled it all immediately, only then realizing that the seaweed had been infused with alcohol. He promptly complained that he still had tasks to complete later, but one of the women simply chuckled and informed him that before tackling any work, he should first relax his body. If he departed in that state, the ladies would be disheartened. Nevertheless, for some inexplicable reason, an unusual notion emerged in Cho Won's mind. He couldn't dismiss the sensation that his fortune today had been remarkably favorable. The setting changed once more, and the heavens had already darkened. Close to the shipping docks, Cho Won-pil stood alongside another individual by the water's edge, both gripping fishing poles as if anticipating a catch from the depths. Cho Won-pil found himself muttering in frustration. They were supposedly there to collect a consignment, yet now they were stranded like fools waiting for it. The other man appeared equally powerless and remarked that the vendors required it to be handled this manner, leaving him with no alternatives. A dark satchel was pulled from the depths of the water. Upon opening it, the man discovered it was brimming with a white substance. No clarification was required. It was narcotics. As he adeptly assessed the authenticity, he cautioned Cho Won-pil that a transaction of this nature was something that only a select few ought to be aware of. The more individuals he involved unnecessarily, the more convoluted the narrative became, unless he genuinely wished for Joe TCI to eliminate them all in a single stroke. As soon as he verified that the item was untainted, he gestured to Cho Won-pil to settle the payment. However, at the precise instant he transferred the items and readied for a seamless exchange, a voice echoed from afar, commanding them to remain still. A contingent of customs agents swiftly arrived on bicycles, insisting that they assist with an examination. The scene immediately unsettled the man, prompting him to urgently inquire of Cho Won-pil what their next course of action should be. However, Cho Won-pil merely instructed him to prioritize the acquisition of the merchandise initially. The individual subsequently inquired about how to handle the funds, contemplating if they ought to simply discard it and flee since they had already obtained the merchandise. Cho Won-pil detonated immediately, indicating that discarding the cash would only highlight their involvement in drug trafficking. Both the money and the merchandise needed to be preserved. Not a single portion could be forfeited. At that moment, the initial glimmer of daybreak was starting to appear over the water, while the two men escaped in complete chaos from the customs agents pursuing them. As Cho Won-pil dashed forward, he began to vocalize his calculations, reasoning that if customs had already arrived, then it was likely that the seller's position had been compromised. The other individual had not even comprehended that yet when Cho Won-pil berated him, exclaiming, "How can you not understand? If they unsettled the individuals behind them, then this entire delivery would essentially turn into complimentary merchandise." He then insisted on taking the car keys from the man, asserting that he would navigate from this point. However, the moment the keys made contact with his palm, Cho Won-pil's expression shifted, and he icily instructed the man to remain composed and be patient. He would have his subordinates rescue him with funds subsequently. Before the other individual could respond, Cho Won-pil's fist was already colliding with his visage, and, given the man's fondness for conversation, Cho Won-pil concluded that he might take some time to recuperate in a confinement cell. Once the situation calmed, he assured that he would return to retrieve him. By the time authorities reached the location, all they discovered was the insensible individual, while Cho Won-pil stayed concealed behind a freight container, observing the entire event with a frigid stare. After verifying it was secure, he pivoted, entered the vehicle, and sped away with a forceful push on the gas pedal. While traveling, Cho Won-pil exhaled deeply, reflecting on how near he had been to apprehension. Had he been apprehended this time, he might have never emerged again. Yet, what had prompted customs to show up unexpectedly? Such an occurrence had never transpired previously. He couldn't comprehend the reasoning, but he also felt no inclination to ruminate on it. Regardless of his perspective, the merchandise was secure, the cash was in his possession, and the day had unfolded nearly flawlessly. Contemplating that, the edge of Cho Won-pil's lips curled upward. His fortune had indeed been remarkably favorable today. However, before he could relish it for an extended period, he abruptly observed that the fuel indicator was nearly depleted. Nonetheless, he merely paused for an instant. He then curved his lips into a smile. So what? Today was his fortunate day. Ultimately, before too long, Cho Won-pil arrived at the Chunram fuel station, stationed the vehicle, and instructed the attendant to top it off completely. As the tank was being replenished, his thoughts continued to revolve around the recent events. If authorities had abruptly intervened, it was likely that the previous trade pathway had been revealed, indicating he would need to gradually begin establishing new clientele. Just while he pondered that, an unusual noise abruptly jolted him from his reverie, and the attendant expressed his apologies clumsily, stating that he had inadvertently fueled the vehicle with diesel rather than petrol. Cho Won-pil's expression soured instantly. He exited the vehicle, glared at the bewildered attendant, and inquired urgently about what was meant to transpire with the car at that moment. It was merely due to his fortuitous good spirits today. Otherwise, that fool would have already met his end. However, just as he was launching into the individual, two vans approached the gas station from opposing directions and effectively obstructed both exits. Cho Won-pil gazed at the tableau and momentarily halted. Subsequently, the doors swung open, and a gentleman emerged with a grin, expressing pleasure at the sight of him. As that individual maneuvered an entire group of ruffians into place and secured the vicinity, Cho Won-pil ultimately identified him. It was Shin Sang-gue from Poppy Game. Cho Won-pil was undeniably taken by surprise. However, Shin Sang-gue did not hesitate to be straightforward. He candidly disclosed that a few days prior, he had encountered some difficulties with a few of Cho Won-pil's followers. It was only afterwards that he discovered those individuals had also been uninformed. The instant he learned that, Cho Won-pil realized they were discussing Dharma's team. Shin Sang-gue emitted a frosty chuckle and remarked that there was no use in prolonging the conversation. It was preferable to resolve this matter swiftly. Poppy Game was not inclined to show mercy simply due to his affiliation with Huang Gang, and his associates were already ready. With that, Shin Sang-gue relinquished all facade and unequivocally commanded them to proceed. The scene then transitioned back to Ma Supto's prior discussion with So Sun-up, detailing the complete narrative of how Cho Won-pil had orchestrated their entanglement in drug trafficking, and his intention to employ the Poppy Gang to eliminate them. Ma Supto adeptly navigated the emotional aspect, asserting that he would never dream of deceiving his superior. After all, So Sun-up had been the one to personally uplift him, yet Cho Won-pil was attempting to drag him into the mire instead. Was that not equivalent to openly disrespecting So Sun-up? Upon hearing this, So Sang-alt's demeanor instantly soured, and he even declared that he would directly inform Jotis about Cho Won-pil's narcotics trafficking. But Ma Supto emphasized that mere words might not suffice for the superiors to have confidence in him, since Cho Won-pil was among Jotis's most reliable squad leaders. If they mismanaged this, not only would they fail to subdue him, but they could also jeopardize themselves, so rather than reporting him carelessly, it was wiser to unveil the entire scenario comprehensively. Recognizing that So Sang-up had unmistakably fallen for the lure, Ma Supto finally commenced detailing his strategy, clarifying that Poppy Gang had largely deciphered how Cho Won-pil conducted his dealings. Given that the individual consistently operated with a limited entourage, the likelihood of him appearing in person at the forthcoming transaction was significantly elevated. When that occurred, members of the Poppy Gang, masquerading as customs officials, would arrive on the scene. The objective was not to genuinely apprehend him, but rather to create the illusion that they were close to capturing him, only to intentionally intentionally allow him to flee. And while stalling amidst the chaos, they would stealthily extract the gasoline from his vehicle, forcing him to make his way to the closest fuel station, where that fuel station would ultimately serve as the true location to conclude Cho Won-pil. Although the intricate specifics of how to secure the trap afterward, Ma Supto remarked, could be clarified gradually at a later time. Upon absorbing all the information, So Sang-up grew wary and inquired if Ma Supto harbored a private vendetta against Cho Won-pil. If not, what was the rationale behind such relentless pursuit? Ma Supto merely smirked and claimed it was all for the benefit of the organization. So Sang-up pressed on, demanding to know how he intended to resolve the matter ultimately, but Ma Supto refrained from giving a straightforward reply. Instead, he lifted the lighter in his grasp, and the moment the flame ignited, the implication was unmistakable without the need for words. Ultimately, every single piece of evidence would be incinerated. Yet, despite the apparent perfection of the scheme, it concealed a critical defect. Every single one of them had misjudged one crucial aspect: Cho Won-pil's true prowess in battle. Shin Sang-yu had merely just issued the command to sever his reins first, when the employee, who had been masquerading as a fuel station attendant, sprang forward from behind before the statement was even concluded. However, in the following moment, Cho Won-pil pivoted, seized the fuel nozzle adjacent to him, and doused the individual with gasoline in a single accurate jet. Subsequently, with the merest flick of his fingers, he propelled the cigarette stub in his grasp, soaring, and in that moment the blaze erupted outward, infernos surging uncontrollably as they engulfed all in their vicinity. All individuals present were paralyzed, astonished by the abrupt surge of flames. Only, at that moment, Cho Won-pil completely understood that the individuals orchestrating this scheme were Ma Supto and So Sang-up. Nevertheless, regardless of how he perceived the situation, he had indeed misjudged their capabilities this time. Noticing this, Shin Sang-yu promptly commanded his associate to bring him down immediately. Yet, in the very next moment, he abruptly realized that fuel had already dispersed around his feet, as the assailant, consumed by fire, continued to wail in torment on the ground. Cho Won-pil paid no mind to the remainder of it. He merely struck the flaming individual forcefully to the ground. The fuel on the surface ignited instantly, and the fire swept over the ground with such speed that the nearby ruffians were compelled to stagger backward. Positioned amid the glow of the flames and the tendrils of smoke, Cho Won-pil icily remarked that whenever he indulged in crucian carp cakes, he invariably commenced with the tail, since the pinnacle, the finest aspect, was intended to be relished at the end. Thus, today would be no exception. He would begin at the rear and dismantle the Poppy Gang fragment by fragment, ensuring they grasped precisely the significance of the name Cho Won-pil. In the following moment, the initial surge of ruffians charged at him with ferocity. However, Cho Won-pil remained entirely composed, seized the fuel nozzle once more, and discharged it directly at them. Immediately afterward, he seized a flaming wooden branch from the vicinity and brought it crashing down upon the individual before him, striking with sufficient force to incapacitate him instantly. He swept the rod laterally next and struck it against the visage of a hairless brute. Cho Won-pil advanced with astonishing swiftness and dexterity. Before the other two ruffians could even respond, he was already upon them. As the stick splintered in two, another individual collapsed to the earth. An individual cried out in distress, alerting the others that his firearm had malfunctioned. But before the phrases had even completely settled, Cho Won-pil had already captured the fractured portion he had discarded previously, grasping a rough fragment of timber in either hand. He twisted his mouth into a playful smirk and remarked that merely brandishing rods was somewhat tedious. Was it not? Subsequently, he advanced in a single fluid movement. Before the assailant in front of him fully comprehended the situation, he had already been pierced and collapsed, shrieking to the earth. Cho Won-pil erupted from the flames amidst the throng like a frenzied creature, relentless. However, in the subsequent moment, a surge of dense white fog barreled directly towards Cho Won-pil's face, engulfing his sight entirely. Shin Sang-yu had seized a fire extinguisher and was directing it at him with a mocking grin. "Since you have such a fondness for white powder, you might as well suffocate on it all." Witnessing Cho Won-pil finally being restrained for a brief moment, Shin Sang-yu could hardly suppress his exhilaration and swiftly turned to shout at his subordinates, "Incapacitate one of his legs while we have the opportunity." However, in the next instant, the grin on his face became rigid and unyielding, as all the subordinates behind him were already laid out on the ground in utter disarray. Before Shin Sang-yu could fully comprehend the situation, a fuel line had been forcefully inserted directly into his mouth. Then Cho Won-pil charged in and knocked him to the floor, restraining him with his entire mass. Bending in close, he icily inquired when precisely Poppy Gang commenced collaborating with So Sang, and how on earth he had the audacity to thrust someone like you into this predicament. While he conversed, he squeezed the trigger, and fuel commenced cascading in heavy torrents torrents down Shin Sang-yui's gullet. The more Cho Won-pil reflecting on it, the more entertained he grew. He had not anticipated that the office dweller, So-sang, would genuinely possess such audacity. If all So-sang had accomplished was discovering the drug smuggling, he could have merely approached Jo Tees and reported it like a loyal pet. However, at this moment, Cho Won-pil comprehended precisely why So-sang had desired to escalate matters to this extent. Since Jo Tees would never have accepted their claims, the strategy was to eliminate him immediately at that location. Cho Won-pil confessed that this time he had truly misjudged So-sang. Yet the individual still exhibited a noticeable deficiency in judgment if he believed that a mere handful of delinquents could thwart him. The setting changed once more, this time to the domain governed by So-sang. He stood there in a wretched temper, lamenting why that previous group of girls had returned when everything had been set. While they feebly objected, they were merely 21. So-sang exhaled a weary breath, contemplating why only this type of nonsense continuously seemed to fall upon him today. Meanwhile, he was discreetly assessing the circumstances in his mind. As per the strategy, Cho Won-pil ought to have been retrieved by Poppy Gang by this point. However, there had been no updates whatsoever, and at that notion, he instinctively shielded his mouth. Then, unable to restrain himself any further, So-sang erupted into laughter, murmuring, "Serves the scoundrel right. He ought to have faced the consequences long before this." In the thoughts of So-sang Yup, there existed a singular explanation for Cho Won-pil's current predicament. He had been foolish enough to oppose him, yet before the phrases had completely departed his lips, a silhouette quietly ascended behind him. In the following moment, a fist shattered the glass as a hand gripped firmly around his neck from behind. So-sang Up's grin halted abruptly as he came to the startling realization that the madman Cho Won-pil was, in fact, still breathing. Cho Won-pil icily informed him, "As soon as you discovered the narcotics smuggling, regardless of your belief in it, you ought to have swiftly approached Jo Tees. But rather, you opted to snuggle up to Poppy Gang. Ultimately, it all boiled down to a singular motive. You desired my demise so intensely that you attempted to employ another's hands to achieve it, keeping your own hands untainted, while I perished as an undisclosed trafficker slain by a competing gang." It was clear that what had enticed him to this place was So-sang Up's own arrogant little plot. Unfortunately, in the end, the individual who would be apprehended in the act of illicit drug trafficking would be So-sang Up himself, while Cho Won-pil would merely be regarded as a man who had retaliated in self-defense after being assaulted by the Poppy Gang. As for breaking this neck first and submitting the report afterward, there was no urgency. Despite the arteries in his neck swelling from the strangulation, So-sang nevertheless succeeded in mustering a grin and remarked, "I documented every utterance you just made." That caused Cho Won-pil to hesitate for the initial instance. Following So-sang Up's gaze, he ultimately perceived Ma Sok-do in the background, observing the entire event transpire. Ma Sek-do gradually advanced. He had recognized from the outset that worthless debris such as Poppy Gang could never genuinely topple Cho Won-pil. But as long as this lunatic experienced the sensation of being betrayed himself, that was already sufficient. Upon hearing that, Cho Won-pil scoffed and inquired whether he had ever perused a book in his existence. Meanwhile, So-sang made a strenuous effort to clarify, stating, "That's referred to as empathizing with others." Cho Won-pil candidly acknowledged, "Indeed, I made a mistake this time. Ma Sek-do's intellect truly corresponds with his appearance. Nevertheless, when all is said and done, you remain merely a petty thug. What precisely do you think you are capable of? Do you genuinely think you can apprehend me? Provided I tidy the two of you up immediately, all will be concealed permanently. This only demonstrates one fact. Today is indeed still my fortunate day. The sun has already set, and much like on a fortuitous day, the tale has reached its conclusion. There is no return for you now." However, Ma Sek-do merely grinned and responded, "No, this is far from the conclusion. The true finale is just commencing now." He then mentioned that he was poised to recount the tale for Cho Won-pil. Cho Won-pil's Unfortunate Day, adapted by Ma Sek-do. On October 13, 1990, the then-President Roh Tae-woo of Korea presented a notable speech and formally announced a campaign against criminal activity. It was a countrywide offensive against gangs on a magnitude that Korea had never previously experienced, intended to dismantle the syndicates of organized crime that had proliferated alongside the nation's swift economic expansion. Subsequent to that announcement, despite numerous prominent gang leaders being apprehended, including members of the nationwide violent organization Bomshin Gang, spring never genuinely arrived. After the downfall of the previous regime, the wild hounds that once had owners lost their standing and transformed into frenzied vagrants. At that instant, the bloodied individual on the earth was persistently howling, inquiring, "Do you truly recognize my identity?" However, the younger Cho Won-pil remained completely indifferent. He brought a metal pipe down with unwavering resolve and stated, "No one is concerned any longer longer about who you once were. You are merely feral canines. What difference does it make if your origins trace back to Bombshin Gang? Now you're simply refused, no longer even deserving of detainment. With that, Cho Won-pil brandished a blade and plunged it into the man repeatedly. He then pivoted and executed another strike against the foe, attempting to surprise him from the rear. Before too long, every subordinate present had already collapsed. Departing with the sole leader collapsed on the floor, quaking as he inquired, "We hold no genuine animosity towards one another. What prompted it to conclude in this manner?" Cho Won-pil responded serenely, "I merely sought to ascertain what types of individuals remained after the battle against crime. The answer is straightforward. Cowards were merely inferior weaklings. However, that was merely a ruse. The true motive for his visit that day was to pilfer the funds set aside for securing Boss Sayok's release. The individual could scarcely comprehend it. For such a modest sum of bail, you exterminated this many individuals." However, prior to him uttering another word, Cho Won-pil seized him and remarked that a group of homeless dogs, lacking a master, still behaves as though they are ferocious hunting canines. If you truly wish to survive, then continue howling, and howl even more loudly. Perhaps your guardian will genuinely listen to you and arrive. Upon completing the task, Cho Won-pil descended the staircase. However, the instant he emerged, he discovered an individual already anticipating his arrival. The individual summoned his name and expressed a desire for a conversation. That individual was Park Wijyu, Hwang Gang's deputy and one of its premier leaders. Cho Won-pil scrutinized him from head to toe. He then emitted a frigid chuckle, evidently presuming that the man had arrived to claim his portion of the bail funds as well. To him, Park Wijyu appeared to be the sort of inconsequential individual who had emerged from an obscure alley that no one had ever known. Regardless of whether it was the police or the Bangkan Gang, Cho Won-pil held no fear of either. Anyone who ventured to handle his finances was destined to face consequences far more severe than merely a puncture in their flesh. However, Park Wijyu casually remarked as if all of that were inconsequential, stating that an individual with your audacity and bravery could potentially be advantageous to us. Park Wijyu glanced at the vehicle trailing him and shouted, "Chief." An instant later, the door swung ajar and a gentleman emerged at a leisurely tempo. In the gaze of that man, if he sought to subdue a feral canine that roamed freely after the loss of its owner, the initial step he took was to shatter its fangs. And that man was Cho Tis, the prospective ruler of the underworld and leader of Hwang Gang. This evening, he was eager to determine if the scoundrel was truly deserving of the solitary blow he had readied for him. It was only at that moment that Cho Won-pil truly grasped that they were not present to pilfer his funds. They had come to enlist him. His hold on the blade in his grasp grew firmer, and a portion of him contemplated that it turned out well since he happened to require a vehicle at this moment. In the following moment, Cho Won-pil surged directly towards Cho Tis. However, Cho Tis didn't even make an effort to evade. He effortlessly landed a precise strike directly into the oncoming assault aimed at him, and Cho Won-pil fell immediately. As Cho Tis cleansed the crimson from his hand, he gazed down at him and icily remarked, "From this instant forward, you are under the dominion of Hwang Gang. This association will reemerge and seize dominance over Korea's criminal underbelly. Seoul is currently a lawless territory, and Hwang Gang is poised to establish its own empire upon it. From that moment onward, paradise will be Hwang Gang itself, and there exists but a single principle that everyone must recall in this domain. There are no additional regulations. I, Cho Tis, embody the principle." Ultimately, collaborating with Hwang Gang was not particularly intricate. Accumulate profits when it was the right moment to do so, and when the time arrived, brandish your firearm for Hwang Gang. In the current moment, the confrontation between Ma Suk-do and Cho Won-pil had escalated to a critical level, as Cho Won-pil thrusts repeatedly with the weapon in his grasp, forcing Ma Suk-do to continuously evade and maneuver away. However, the moment Cho Won-pil retracted the blade, Ma Suk-do capitalized on the opportunity and delivered a savage straight blow. Cho Won-pil raised his defenses just in time. However, the force still propelled him backward and violently collided him against the vehicle positioned behind him. That solitary strike evoked recollections that Cho Won-pil despised recalling. Above all, he loathed boxers. He abhorred them to his core. However, Ma Suk-do allowed him no respite. The second blow struck forcefully immediately following the first, and Cho Won-pil swiftly seized a vehicle's side mirror from the vicinity and crashed it forcefully into Ma Suk-do. When Ma Suk-do regained his balance and glanced upward once more, Cho Won-pil had already vanished into the labyrinth of closely clustered automobiles surrounding them. Then Cho Won-pil's voice reverberated from within the ranks of vehicles, deriding Ma Suk-do. "You will never comprehend. Years prior, I truly did succumb to a pugilist. However, subsequent to that loss, I meticulously revisited the entire battle repeatedly, dissecting it mentally an infinite infinite number of times, anticipating the moment when I could ultimately reclaim my victory. And as destiny would unfold, the individual before me at this moment is yet another infuriating pugilist. As he spoke, he had already stealthily positioned himself behind Ma Suk-do, sneering, "This is precisely why I proclaimed that today is my fortunate day." In the following moment, the sword descended sharply from above. However, Ma Suk-do responded swiftly and fell back out of the trajectory. Merely for the counterstrike he delivered in reaction to collide with the side of a proximate vehicle instead. And at that precise instant, he ultimately comprehended what Cho Won-pil was attempting to achieve. Cho Won-pil had intentionally leveraged his physical stature to corner Ma Suk-do into a confined area between the vehicles. At that moment, evading to the left or right was already quite challenging. With the space so restricted, Ma Suk-do could scarcely maneuver his body, much less deliver his strikes effectively. Furthermore, Cho Won-pil wielded a knife. In their intimate struggle, Ma Suk-do found himself hampered at every opportunity. He had unwittingly stepped directly into the snare that Cho Won-pil had designed. Cho Won-pil afforded him no opportunity for contemplation. The assaults arrived in unyielding surges, one following the next. With the area so confined, every strike Ma Suk-do attempted was restricted by his surroundings. Cho Won-pil deftly maneuvered around them, while Ma Suk-do's punches continually smashed against the car windows nearby. Yet, in the minuscule interval separating one thrust from the subsequent, Ma Suk-do abruptly thrust a powerful fist forward, shattering Cho Won-pil's knife-wielding arm against the car window. Then he performed an act so peculiar that even Cho Won-pil hesitated. He began shattering every automobile window in his vicinity with both hands. Observing that, Cho Won-pil emitted a derisive chuckle. To him, Ma Suk-do appeared to be on the verge of experiencing utter exasperation, as Cho Won-pil still possessed the blade. In such confined conditions, Ma Suk-do was unable to effectively retaliate. The area was too restricted for him to take any significant action. Thus, all he seemed capable of doing at this point was vent his fury on the pain, even shattering the very windows that might have served to instill fear in others. And Cho Won-pil desired to witness precisely what type of challenge the individual still believed he possessed. As he gradually diminished the gap, he remarked, "Although my supervisor and I don't align on every principle, there is one aspect we concur on. The scoundrel who strikes last must face demise." But at the precise moment he lifted the blade to strike it down, a forceful impact struck directly against his right eye. Ma Suk-do's strike had detonated against him, propelling him backward, and a portion of Cho Won-pil's visage rapidly became inflamed. This utterly obliterated his anticipations. In a domain this confined, Ma Suk-do ought not to have been capable of producing such strength whatsoever. Before he could entirely comprehend it, another forceful blow struck directly onto his visage. It was only at that moment that Cho Won-pil truly comprehended. Ma Suk-do had not broken those windows in a fit of rage. He accomplished this to make space for producing energy. Everything that appeared to be impulsive urgency had, in fact, been a strategic maneuver to create sufficient room to strike. Following a barrage of blows, Cho Won-pil ultimately broke down. Had Ma Suk-do established room for himself? Consequently, Cho Won-pil was not obligated to adhere to the antiquated cadence any longer. As long as he could wield the blade, the upper hand remained with him. However, the instant he attempted it, he discovered that his weapon had become firmly ensnared by the vehicle structure adjacent to him. Brief strikes remained effective, yet a more elongated weapon had grown cumbersome and excessively lengthy for proper utilization. The reach advantage he had once taken pride in had abruptly transformed into a burden. In the very next instant, Ma Suk-do propelled him backwards with yet another blow, and Cho Won-pil plummeted forcefully to the surface. Ma Suk-do intervened and seized him by the collar, then delivered another blow directly to his visage. For the very first time, Cho Won-pil felt a surge of anxiety and began imploring him to cease. However, Ma Suk-do paid him no attention and continued to unleash a barrage of strikes upon him. Beneath the barrage of strikes, a damp mark gradually expanded over Cho Won-pil's trousers. In a state of desperation, he made one final attempt to conceal himself behind his authority and intimidated Ma Suk-do, declaring, "This is defiance. You're a Huang Gang associate audaciously assaulting one of the organization's operational leaders. Zhou TCI prioritizes regulations above all else. If he discovers this, he will never permit you to escape. Regardless of how formidable an individual may be, it is impossible to confront the entire Huang Gang." However, before he could conclude, Ma Suk-do interjected with a grin and inquired, "Do you genuinely think that unleashing Poppy Gang upon you is an endeavor that Sanup could have accomplished all by himself?" The scene reverted to a previous moment, where members of Poppy Gang faced another individual and presented the circumstances. Cho Won-pil had encroached upon our domain and was clandestinely conducting drug transactions. We understand that antagonizing Huang Gang will yield no favorable outcomes. Yet this instance, the miscreant is evidently Cho Won-pil. The person who had arrived to seek clarification was Poppy Gang's foremost leader, boss Lee Chun-sa, and the individual seated opposite him was, undoubtedly, Huang Gang's genuine superior, Zhou Tci. Zhou Tci responded with composure, stating, individuals like us, those who have thrived in this environment without a hint of trepidation towards the authorities, have no need to converse in such a subdued and careful manner. Regarding Cho Won-pil engaging in clandestine drug activities, I shall not interfere. And the significance of those words was clear enough for Lee Chun-sa to comprehend. Huang Gang abstained from narcotics. Given that Cho Won-pil had violated the regulation, he warranted death. At that moment, Cho Won-pil finally grasped the reality. Zhou Tci had entirely discarded him. He was consumed by acrimonious bitterness. After generating so much wealth for that individual, he ultimately found himself regarded as nothing more than a disposable pawn to be discarded once the labor was completed. In the subsequent moment, he fell to his knees and fervently implored Ma Sok-du for mercy, regardless of the cost. He persisted, claiming there must be some miscommunication on the employer's part. If I could merely encounter Zhou Tci face to face and articulate my perspective directly, everything could still be resolved. As long as you permit me to survive, I am willing to do anything. However, what Ma Sok-du uttered next left him utterly astonished. Disrobed, Cho Won-pil paused momentarily, contemplating that Ma Sok-du possessed some peculiar preferences. However, Ma Sok-du was not referring to his attire. What he desired to shed was the very role, the mantle of action team leader. In other terms, Cho Won-pil was preparing to relinquish that position. Despite that, Cho Won-pil remained steadfast, asserting that this is clear defiance. It's entirely inconceivable. Ma Sok-du retorted immediately, asserting, just as I previously mentioned, I possess a strategy. A strategy is as flawless as my own visage. Noticing that the man remained unyielding, Ma Sok-du ceased his verbal efforts and delivered a vicious strike directly to his visage, dislodging Cho Won-pil rendered unconscious instantly. Shortly thereafter, Cho Won-pil was securely bound and muzzled, subsequently brought before So Sang-up to anticipate a verdict. Even So Sang-up evidently had not anticipated that Ma Sok-du would truly overpower that maniac into compliance. Ma Sok-du subsequently inquired, what are we meant to do next? Sang-up's demeanor soured as he responded, we precisely follow the instructions given by the supervisor. As soon as he uttered those words, he drew a knife from behind him. However, rather than employing it himself, he extended it toward Ma Sok-du, clearly indicating his desire for him to carry out the murder. Ma Sok-du's heart constricted instantly. As a law enforcement officer, he had no desire to taint his hands with blood in reality. Yet So Sang-up was clearly not jesting. In his view, if Cho Won-pil survived, what followed would not merely be retribution, it could signify incarceration. Thus, Ma Sok-du swiftly feigned ignorance and requested So Sang-up to illustrate first in order to preserve his dignity. So Sang-up had no option but to take the initiative himself, even though internally he was equally frightened. After all, he had never truly taken a life in his existence, so he began muttering curses softly to bolster his courage, raising the knife as though he were truly on the verge of dispatching Cho Won-pil directly to oblivion. Coming to the realization that mortality could genuinely be imminent before him this occasion, tears unexpectedly began streaming from Cho Won-pil's eyes. So Sang-up, who was on the verge of attacking him, witnessed the entire incident distinctly, and the disparity was nearly preposterous. Thus, Sang-up's contorted, malevolent visage on one end, and Cho Won-pil's face marked by tears on the opposite side. Noticing that So Sang-up couldn't suppress a surge of compassion from welling up within him, Ma Sok-du promptly cautioned him not to be deceived by insincere displays of sorrow. However, So Sang-up persisted and commanded action. Having already divulged all the information, it was time to conclude matters. When Ma Sok-du continued to offer justifications, So Sang-up invoked the previous act of defiance to apply additional pressure, while Ma Sok-du merely maintained his pretense of ignorance, claiming he was unaware of any such gang regulations. The pair continued to bicker until the situation became absurd, ultimately leading them to directly inquire of Cho Won-pil himself about the precise method of his demise. As soon as the adhesive strip was torn away from his lips, Cho Won-pil immediately began pleading like a lunatic, declaring he desired neither the substances nor the cash any longer. He merely wished to survive. He continued to curse, I genuinely lament all that has transpired. I've already diminished myself to this extent. Please just allow me to leave. Still gripping the blade as he advanced, So Sang-up rasped, I also wish to avoid bloodshed, yet certain matters cannot be rectified with mere words of remorse. If I do not end your life today, it could very well be my own that is lost later. Only a total fool would show mercy to someone like you. Furthermore, considering the sort sort of filth you are. If we permit you to survive at this moment, he will undoubtedly return to eliminate us eventually. However, as soon as those words were uttered, Cho Won-pil abruptly began to pound his forehead against the earth repeatedly, and the utter audacity of it entirely took Saw Sang-up by surprise. For a moment, he was unable to grasp what he was engaged in. It persisted until blood spattered everywhere and even teeth became dislodged, and only then did Cho Won-pil finally manage to utter, "I can inform everyone that I have already perished in the blaze. If the remains are incinerated beyond identification, no one will be able to recognize them. As for you, truly eliminating me won't be nearly as effortless to conceal as you presume. From this moment forward, I shall exist like a concealed rodent, never revealing my visage again. I implore you, grant me mercy this once," which the cowardly, profoundly degrading manner of pleading left both Ma Saw Sang-up and Saw Sang-up gazing in astonishment. Ultimately, Saw Sang-up could merely exhale and instruct Ma Saw-tu to tidy up the area, effectively opting to spare Cho Won-pil for the time being. Ma Saw-tu remained thoroughly skeptical, yet at that moment the reality was that they could not bring themselves to eliminate him immediately. While Ma Saw-tu was contemplating his next course of action, Cho Won-pil abruptly addressed him. As soon as Ma Saw-tu raised his gaze, a torrent of blood burst forth directly into his visage. In that fleeting moment, when his sight was obstructed, Cho Won-pil leaped up and dashed towards the exit. Ma Saw-tu promptly exclaimed, "Saw Sang-up, impede him!" However, Seo Sang-up was an individual who relied on intellect rather than physical prowess, and even in opposition to an adversary who was scarcely capable of retaliating, the blade she wielded was still effortlessly evaded when Cho Won-pil crouched down. In the following moment, Cho Won-pil thrust his head directly into Saw Sang-up's abdomen and surged past him. Disregarding the crimson still clinging to the edge of his lips, Cho Won-pil sprinted for his survival, executing point during, shredding the final remnants of the bindings still adhering to his physique. With agony surging through him with such intensity, it felt as though his whole being could disintegrate at any moment. Nevertheless, a single idea propelled him forward. He was still breathing. The narcotics from the incomplete transaction and the cash were still in the vehicle. If he reclaimed those, then whether he purified his identity or escaped the nation, he could still begin anew. He desperately scanned his surroundings, attempting to locate his car. When he had leapt out earlier, it had been too hasty for him to distinctly recall precisely where he had stationed his vehicle. Fortunately, the Jeep remained distinctive amidst the other vehicles, allowing him to locate it swiftly. He opened the door, climbed in, and ignited the engine. The entire sequence proceeded seamlessly. Only, at that moment, Cho Won-pil finally allowed himself to exhale, sensing for the first time that perhaps he had truly succeeded. As he hurriedly departed, he continued to mutter expletives softly. "Blast it, I nearly fell victim to those scoundrels." And before too long, that transformed into self-satisfied contentment. Indeed, fortune remained in his favor today. Clenching his jaws, he vowed that regardless of the expense, he would eradicate Ma Saw-tu's clan, his associates, everyone. He would eliminate each and every one of them. However, as he immersed himself in that notion, he remained oblivious to the pair of eyes that were icy and focused on him from the rear seat. In the following instant, two hands emerged from behind and fiercely gripped his side. Cho Won-pil emitted a primal scream as Ma Saw-tu clasped him firmly and nonchalantly remarked, "Fasten your seatbelt, it's for your protection." Stunned and infuriated, Cho Won-pil inquired how he had wound up in the vehicle. Ma Saw-tu responded with composure, "I have been seated in the rear since the instant you were darting about like a frantic creature in search of your vehicle." He also interjected a sarcastic comment, noting that his prior apology had been aimed at the incorrect individual. "The individuals you truly owe a reconciliation to are everyone you've harassed thus far. Additionally, all the lives devastated by the substances he disseminated." As the words escaped his lips, Ma Saw-tu tightened his grip even more and declared, "From this moment forward, this is your safety harness. Additionally, this safety belt will determine your fate. I will personally guide you through the true path of atonement. Now take a right turn." As the order was issued, the unit intensified its grip once more, fracturing the ribs on Cho Won-pil's right flank, causing crimson to spurt from the edge of his lips as he howled, and the automobile swerved abruptly to the right along with it. Throughout the remainder of the journey, the sole occupants of the vehicle were Ma Saw-tu's composed directives and Cho Won-pil's progressively fractured wails. As they approached their objective, Ma Saw-tu clenched his hold once again and icily instructed, "Now halt." The vehicle came to a halt, and as it did, they found themselves positioned directly in front of the law enforcement agency. Shortly thereafter, Lee Sun-young emerged in person upon receiving news, and the scene before him rendered him momentarily paralyzed as, within the vehicle, there lay only an unresponsive Cho Won-pil, along with the backpack and narcotics still grasped tightly in his embrace. Subsequently, the perspective altered once once more, reverting to Hong Kong's foundation. Thus, Sang-up was serenely informing the trio of men before him. Fearful of meeting his demise at the hands of the leader, Cho Won-pil opted to surrender to the authorities with the narcotics, instead of confronting death, aspiring to seek refuge within a correctional facility where he could endure. As he uttered the phrases with an expressionless demeanor, nonetheless, his anxiety was taut beneath the surface, as he had never anticipated that the most bothersome individuals in the vicinity would ultimately converge in a single location simultaneously, positioned before So Sang-up at that instant where the trio of action team leaders from Hong Kong. The initial speaker was the attractive individual donned in a floral-patterned shirt with lengthy locks, Mu Jin-hyuk, one of the captains of an action team in Hong Kong. Adjacent to him was the stoutly built fellow in a tailored suit, Gu Manji, with his hands clasped before him. The final individual was Ping Young-ha, donning a short-sleeved shirt, a serpentine dragon tattoo adorning his right arm, inscriptions on his left, and a pronounced scar etched across the corner of his mouth. The three of them exchanged dialogue in turns, with each utterance conveying the same significance. How had someone like Cho Won-pil, who didn't even possess genuine Bomshan lineage, managed to ascend to a position within the cadre in the first instance? As the dialogue progressed, the responsibility seamlessly transitioned until it rested firmly on So Sang-up's shoulders. Only after they had expressed their frustrations did So Sang-up finally respond, stating, "With Cho Won-pil's role vacant, the leader has already appointed a new captain for the action team." Indeed, as everyone had anticipated, the individual who entered was Ma Suk-do along with his entourage. Due to his significant contribution in dismantling Cho Won-pil, Ma Suk-do had now formally ascended to the position of Huanggang's new operations team leader. The moment it was declared, all three responded in distinct ways. Gu Manji was the first to object, labeling it preposterous. Individuals like them had fought tenaciously since the Bunchen gang days, putting their lives on the line for years merely to occupy the positions they held now. Mu Jin-chuk, on the other hand, adopted a contrasting viewpoint. To him, the only thing of significance was the completion of the task at hand. The ancient titans had already been removed in shackles, rendering any effort to preserve the traditional order futile. Peng Yong-ha remarked that an entity lacking regulations was not an entity in any sense. As this was the leader's determination, they had no option but to acquiesce, yet the reality persisted. Any validity that once prevailed was already beginning to decay. As the dispute intensified, one of the subordinates abruptly burst in, clearly agitated, and interrupted them. He then proclaimed in a booming voice that the supervisor had come. The utterances triggered every fiber in Ma Suk-do's physique. Tightened simultaneously, he reminisced about those secondary school years when he had sparred with that individual, observed him storm through the arena en route to a title, and recalled that the entire motivation behind his initial foray into boxing was due to that very individual. As the lift doors gradually swung open, that eagerly anticipated instant had finally come. For the very first time, Ma Suk-do found himself present at one of Huang Gan's significant gatherings, finally witnessing firsthand the ultimate objective for which he had sacrificed everything to attain. The individual he had penetrated the criminal underworld to annihilate. The figure his historical resentments compelled him to personally vanquish. Huang Gan's genuine superior, Zhou Tci. Zhou Tci was the first to address the group, inquiring, "Is the individual before me the one who received all the accolades this time?" Thus, EP promptly validated it, and even mentioned that without Ma Suk-do intervening, he himself could have perished at Cho Won-pil's hands. Upon hearing this, Zhou Tci scrutinized Ma Suk-do for a more extended period, then casually commented that his fists undoubtedly possessed a certain quality. Subsequently, he extended a hand and remarked, "Even if you may not appear to be the most astute, nonetheless, congratulations on your appointment as action team leader." However, the individual who extended a hand and responded was not Ma Suk-do. It was Dharma positioned alongside him. Dharma promptly inclined his head and expressed his gratitude repeatedly, assuring that henceforth he would dedicate himself entirely to the institution. Time receded slightly. Previously, Dharma had remained there in utter astonishment, inquiring, "Am I genuinely on the verge of becoming the leader of the action team? Yet it is unmistakably you who apprehended Cho Won-pil." Ma Suk-do never refuted that. He merely stated, "Indeed, I was the one who brought Cho Won-pil down, but a role such as action team captain is meant to be attained through seniority. If I bypass every individual above me and assume it immediately, no one would endorse it. Furthermore, I am already part of your faction. Given that the task is completed, it is entirely logical for you, as the leader of this faction, to receive recognition." Upon hearing this, even Dharma was left in astonishment, nearly unable to comprehend when Ma Suk-do had begun to contemplate such matters on his behalf. He, positioned close by, could not restrain his inquiry. He was unable to comprehend. After all the peril we undertook to apprehend Cho Won-pil, why did we make the effort to surrender him to the authorities. He was confident that the other action team leaders would never allow such a thing to go unnoticed if they discovered it. Suk-do was fully aware of how it would appear, yet there remained a boundary he was unwilling to breach. Regardless of how vile an individual might be, they are still a member of humanity. Taking a life isn't an act one can casually overlook. Even if his adversary were a criminal, he had no desire to transform into the sort of person who regarded homicide as commonplace. And, furthermore, he had already contemplated the broader perspective. The most astute decision at this juncture was to elevate Dharma to the position of action team leader, while he remained in the background, continuing his inquiries. Only then would it become significantly simpler to unearth the proof linking Zhou Taesi to Chairman Zhang. CEO Sang-up, on his end, was likely delighted with that setup as well. If Ma Suk-do truly assumed the role of captain himself, it would become significantly more challenging for CEO Sang-up to continue siphoning funds as he had in the past. Nevertheless, confronting Zhou Taesi directly at this moment, one inquiry persistently lingered in Ma Suk-do's thoughts. Had this scoundrel truly erased his memory of who he was? At that instant, all the recollections and intricate musings appeared to converge into a singular focal point. Returning to the coronation scene, just as Dharma was on the verge of receiving everyone's accolades, a sudden voice pierced through the atmosphere. Gu Manji advanced and candidly contended that the supervisor's initial command had been to eliminate Cho Won-pil, and Dharma had not succeeded in fulfilling that assignment. On that basis alone, he was unqualified to occupy the position of action team leader. Furthermore, Cho Won-pil was currently in police custody, and the moment he began to speak, all the illicit activities the organization had concealed could be exposed to the public. Before Gu Manji could complete her sentence, a resounding thud reverberated through the chamber. The individual who advanced halted directly in front of him, his tone subdued yet piercingly distinct. Cho Won-pil contravened the regulations, and when the regulations are violated, demise is the sole resolution. This remains consistent. The individual who had severed ties with everyone was none other than Huang Gang's second-in-command, Cho Sojo. His stare glided icily across the space as he informed them that there would be no issues on Cho Won-pil's end. The setting changed, and Cho Won-pil found himself isolated in an interrogation chamber with two law enforcement officials positioned opposite him. What astonished them was that after hours of interrogation, he had yet to utter a single significant word. The quantity of narcotics on the table was clearly beyond personal consumption, indicating it was inventory at an organizational level. The agents repeatedly inquired about his affiliation and even suggested that collaboration might benefit him in the future. However, Cho Won-pil exhibited no indication of parting his lips. He comprehended more than anyone that the instant he referred to Huang Gang, he would be regarded as a traitor. And once that transpired, incarceration would not protect him. The syndicate would pursue him relentlessly regardless. At that moment, the senior investigator, who had remained largely silent, finally rose and instructed the junior officer to accompany him outside for a cigarette. The younger individual appeared bewildered but proceeded, though not without cautioning Cho Won-pil, "By the time I return, you had better be prepared to converse." However, prior to departing, the seasoned investigator cast Cho Won-pil a prolonged, meaningful glance, and shortly thereafter the door shut once more, isolating him within the chamber. Alone in his contemplation, Cho Won-pil's mind whirled tumultuously. Masakdo possessed ample opportunity to eliminate him but opted against it, and the more he pondered, the deeper his sense of shame became. It felt as though he had been regarded with such disdain that he was deemed unworthy of even being slain. However, another contemplation arose. Owing to Masakdo, he remained alive and was presently seated there. He inwardly ridiculed himself, thinking that even wallowing in squalor like a canine was preferable to perishing, and perhaps his fortune had not entirely waned. He was beginning to envision how he would exact vengeance on Masakdo once he managed to escape. Subsequently, the door to the interrogation chamber gradually creaked open once more, and Cho Won-pil presumed that the investigators had come back. At that moment, he resolved that this time he would divulge all details regarding the narcotics operation and compel the authorities to dismantle the entire syndicate. However, when he raised his gaze and recognized the individual, he became motionless. Since it was not the authorities at all, it was an individual attired as a middle-aged female vending yogurt. He struggled to comprehend why someone of that nature would be present in an interrogation chamber. What he was unaware of was that this absurd, unsettling figure was in fact Shin Sang-hui, the leader of the puppy gang action crew whom he had nearly slain at the gas station, the individual whose visage had been severely charred. The instant halted as Shin Sang-hui gradually extracted a blade from behind his back and approached Cho Won-pil silently. Meanwhile, at Huang Gang's headquarters, Zhou Tci's tone was composed yet icy enough to chill the atmosphere. He remarked that there is no longer any reason for anyone to be concerned about Cho Won-pil. The only thing thing you must keep in mind is a singular principle. Regulations are regulations, and once those regulations are violated, demise ensues. On this occasion, Puppy Gang will be the entity to bring Cho One Pill to an end, and that was their stipulation. For an instant, my SAP do found it difficult to comprehend what Joe TCI was abruptly articulating, as well as all he could manage was to remain there, gazing at that visage, sensing as if the individual in front of him had transformed into alarmingly strange. The adversary he had once exchanged blows with amidst the downpour now loomed directly before him. However, it seemed as if an entire torrent separated them. The setting changed once more. Dharma found himself immersed in a reverie, positioned at the center of the dormitory with a broad smile adorning his visage, finally occupying the coveted captain's chair of the action team he had long desired. Following all that hardship, fortunate days were finally within his grasp. However, upon noticing that foolish grin on his face, Marasapi Du simply approached and jolted him abruptly out of the dream. Assembling the insights Dharma had shared, Ma Asapi Du finally began charting the internal framework of Huang Gang. The organization comprised a total of 4 team leaders for operations, and presently, Dharma held one of those positions. The other 3 leaders were all individuals who had endured the downfall of Bumchun Gang following the conflict against crime. They were seasoned warriors who had forged their paths through the most brutal years with their own efforts. Their rank was not merely equivalent to that of Chow and Tablets. In certain instances, it surpassed it. The individual who had united those established and emerging factions to transform Huang Gang into its current form was Huang Gang's second-in-command, Pang Young Ha. Ma Asapi still could not comprehend how the authorities had permitted creatures like these to operate unrestrained for such an extended period, but he chose not to linger on that thought for the moment. Instead, he addressed the others and remarked, "If you heed my words, you can all elevate yourselves just as Dharma did." Montu, nonetheless, appeared perplexed and inquired, "But I never aspired to be a leader of the action team. Isn't the individual who genuinely merits that position already present here?" Ma Asapi Du responded with composure, "A coach is never intended to enter the arena themselves. As long as I can remain on the periphery and observe your ascent, that alone suffices for me." As soon as Montu and Weasel learned that Ma Asapi Du intended to assign each of them to roles as team captains in the future, their faces brightened and they promptly vowed to follow their leader to the end. At that moment, the telephone chimed. Dharma rose to respond, while Pai Yu remained close by, attentive, a tumultuous emotion gradually swelling within him. At that instant, Pai Yu genuinely sensed the alarming proficiency of Ma Asapi Du. The individual had not been part of the organization for an extensive period, yet he had already transformed significantly in a remarkably brief span. In contrast, Pai Yu sensed that he had made no progress whatsoever. Regarding the apprehension of Cho One Pill, he had offered minimal assistance. He couldn't cease contemplating when he would attain strength comparable to Sakdu Hyung. Then Dharma, who had gone to respond to the telephone, abruptly shouted to Ma Sakdu, his voice quivering, his entire physique shaking, icy perspiration enveloping his countenance. "As an individual outside is inquiring about you personally and wishes to meet with the supervisor." Upon learning this, Ma Sakdu felt a deep sense of despair as well. However, in the following moment, he compelled himself to scowl and inquired of Dharma directly, "Who precisely is seeking me?" Before long, Ma Sakdu reached the designated spot solo. As soon as he laid eyes on the recognizable structure before him, he couldn't help but reflect to himself that it had indeed been quite a while since his days at Ganghuan Boxing Gym. This was the venue where he had trained during his younger years, the aged gym where he had devoted countless hours striking the punching bag. He never anticipated that the other individual would select this location for their encounter. He nudged the door ajar and entered, and the individual awaiting him had evidently been anticipating his arrival for some time. The gentleman desiring to meet him was Zhou TCI. As soon as their gazes intersected, Zhou TCI welcomed him as though they were long-lost friends. "It's been a while, Ma Sakdu." Sok promptly bowed and reciprocated the greeting, making every effort to maintain a composed demeanor and authentic body language. Zhou TCI beckoned him to take a seat and enjoy a beverage, even assuring him to disregard the men positioned behind him. Then, he personally filled a glass for Ma Sakdu and advised him to unwind, urging him not to be so rigid. Ma Sakdu responded with deference, yet he maintained a conscious distance. Regulations were regulations, and he was fully aware of that. Upon hearing this, Zhou TCI paused for a brief moment, yet he chose not to contest. Subsequently, Ma Sakdu tentatively inquired about his well-being over the years. Ever since that boxing bout during their high school days, this was the initial genuine occasion they had encountered each other once more. During the previous gathering, Zhou TCI had displayed no indication of acknowledging him. Consequently, Ma Sakdu began to believe that the individual had entirely overlooked him. However, Zhou TCI firmly rejected this notion, asserting that there was no possibility he could forget. Then, accompanied by a light-hearted jest, "With a visage like yours, it's challenging to overlook you in any setting." That remark caused one of the subordinates in close proximity to erupt in laughter before he could rein himself in. However, the moment that chuckle slipped out, Zhou Tci's expression remained completely unchanged. He merely placed his glass down forcefully on the table. Nearly simultaneously, Park Wijiu hefted a dumbbell and struck it squarely against the subordinate's visage. The entire event unfolded so abruptly that even Ma Sakdu was momentarily rendered speechless, as the subordinate was forcefully propelled away from his feet, only to be hoisted upright once more by Park Wijiu before he could even touch the ground. Lifting the dumbbell, Park Wijiu's tone became frigid as he posed a singular query. "Is it amusing?" Then the strikes arrived once more consecutively. The supervisor was addressing them. How many instances had they been informed that, in the presence of the supervisor, they were anticipated to understand their position, as if the brutality trailing behind him was completely non-existent. Zhou Tci composedly proceeded, stating that undoubtedly there was a purpose for summoning Ma Sakdu to the location that day. As he spoke, he nonchalantly grabbed the bottle once more and directed it toward Ma Sakdu. Then, rather bluntly, he inquired if Ma Sakdu aspired to become the leader of the action squad. Ma Sakdu appeared noticeably startled. He had certainly not anticipated such a proposition and instinctively responded that a promotion of that magnitude would likely contravene the regulations. However, Zhou Tci merely grinned as if it were insignificant and remarked, "I have previously clarified this. In Huanggang, I am the authority. Moreover, weren't you aspiring for the position of action team leader from the outset?" That solitary statement struck Ma Sakdu with such force that it made his heart race, to such an extent that he failed to observe the beverage in his glass spilling over. Zhou Tci's eyes lingered softly on his visage, his voice as tranquil as usual. However, the subsequent words that escaped his lips pierced directly through Ma Sakdu's facade. "Ma Sakdu, you are an officer, aren't you?" The moment those phrases escaped Zhou Tci's lips, Park Huiju and every subordinate present in the chamber became vigilant, and the entire ambience crystallized into a tense stillness. Chilly perspiration erupted along Ma Sakdu's spine. He was completely unaware of how the individual before him had discerned such an insight. In a fleeting moment, a chilling notion flashed through his mind. Had Zhou Tci truly discerned that I was an officer? The setting abruptly reverted to the evening preceding the covert mission's initiation. Upon hearing Li Sanyong's proposal, Ma Sakdu was engulfed in uncertainties. He was unable to comprehend how merely being a former classmate of Zhou Tci was meant to qualify him as the ideal candidate to penetrate Huanggang. Honestly, he possessed no genuine assurance in it himself. Furthermore, he found it hard to conceive that Zhou Tci would ever place his trust in him so readily. Was a traffic officer known for stirring up issues truly appropriate for such a significant undertaking? However, Li Sanyong candidly conveyed to him that it wasn't merely about the long-standing association. There was a far more significant motive behind his selection. Upon uttering those words, he lifted a finger and directed it straight at Ma Sakdu. "With that visage of yours, anyone who gazes upon you is likely to perceive you as resembling a mobster at first glance." Unsurprisingly, Ma Sakdu reacted poorly to that. He retorted that he remained a law enforcement officer, questioning how Zhou Tci could fail to perceive anything amiss. Numerous undercover agents had previously been compromised and eliminated. However, Li Sanyong countered by inquiring whether an officer currently facing suspension and disciplinary measures could have his records accurately assessed. Ma Sakdu halted abruptly and inquired what precisely that was intended to signify. Was Li Sanyong ridiculing the reality of his suspension? Li Sanyong responded straightforwardly. "It signifies precisely what I expressed. An inactive police officer is, in fact, the most effective type of officer to conceal. That approach had previously been employed by officials during the war on crime period. The issue was that they all subsequently perished at Huanggang's hands, and the entire matter had been concealed. Subsequently, Li Sanyong ultimately revealed the reality to him. There were individuals within the upper echelons of the police force who had ties to Huanggang, which precisely explained why only Ma Sakdu was capable of undertaking this task. The police personnel frameworks were not entirely transparent. Records from the traffic division were not readily accessible to the violent crime unit. The previous undercover agents had been compromised due to their affiliation with the criminal investigation division. In other terms, the informant Huanggang had embedded within the police force was probably situated within the criminal investigation framework. However, Ma Sakdu was a traffic officer. That group would never manage to obtain solid evidence proving his affiliation with the police. Furthermore, he was under suspension at that moment, which rendered even routine identity verifications significantly more challenging. This was the reason Lee Sanyong had continually reiterated the same point. There was no possibility that Zhou Tci could be aware that he was an officer. The recollection ceased at that point. Confronted with Zhou Tci's inquiry at this moment, Ma Sakdu remained unflustered. Rather, he leaned in, displaying an expression of annoyance. As if the idea irked him increasingly, he grasped the glass in his hand and took a forceful gulp. He then casually mentioned that he had previously not succeeded in the written segment of the police examination. He disintegrated. The entire situation was a tremendous nuisance. In my view, you discharge 2 rounds, secure someone with handcuffs, and the task is complete. Why on earth do they compel individuals to commit so many texts to memory? My mind simply isn't designed for that sort of absurdity, and those individuals critiquing me evidently failed to appreciate skill when they encountered it. Paradoxically, that fabricated story ended up precisely where it was intended. Zhou Tci effortlessly retrieved it and scoffed. I had already realized you could never succeed as an officer. Someone like you was evidently never designed for academic pursuits. It was only at that moment that Ma Sakdu completely comprehended the situation. Zhou Tci had already investigated his history. When he was unable to verify it through documentation, he opted to assess him directly. The man possessed an alarmingly astute intellect. Nevertheless, as Lee Sang-yong had foreseen, one aspect remained accurate. The truth that he was a law enforcement officer had not yet been revealed. Although that allowed him to exhale a bit more comfortably for the time being, Ma Sakdu was acutely aware that he was far from sufficiently secure to let his guard down. Since Zhou Tci was far from conventional, Dharma sat there in spectacles, appearing absurdly satisfied with himself. Since he assumed the role of action team leader, all the domain that previously belonged to Zhou One-pil has now been acquired by him. Noticing his excessive arrogance, Ma Sakdu intervened and delivered a solid blow to his flank, then nonchalantly pointed out, "Haven't you ever come across the saying that the more mature the rice, the deeper it bends?" Ma Sakdu then seized the contract next to him and inquired, "What precisely is this regarding?" Dharma rushed to clarify that this ought to be the set of automobile lease agreements we finalized. At its essence, their entire enterprise revolved around acquiring vehicles leased through extended agreements and illicitly subletting them on a short-term basis. Thus, the initial priority was to obtain those long-term leases. Ma Sakdu had already comprehended that to a great extent. However, the genuine inquiry was as follows. If these vehicles were neither Prados nor Azaras, what was the reason behind their substantial rental of so many cars of this category all at once? Dharma appeared equally bewildered. "I have no clue. That was merely the directive from higher authorities. I am unaware of the rationale as well." Yet, Ma Sakdu's intuition as a police officer persistently indicated that this operation was anything but legitimate. He required additional intelligence. He tapped Dharma gently on the head with the agreement and cautioned him, "Moving forward, if anything questionable arises, you must inform me right away." However, just as he concluded his remarks, a voice emerged from behind him and effortlessly continued the conversation. "Our new leader appears to be quite driven." It was Mu Jin-hyuk, the captain of the Huang Gang action team. Dharma promptly dashed over, bowing and fawning. "Boss, when did you arrive?" He quickly supplemented, "Excellent job today, boss." Ma Sakdu instinctively acknowledged him as well, and his heart plummeted. This individual was expected to oversee the entertainment establishments, so why had he abruptly appeared in this location? To make matters worse, he had likely witnessed Ma Sakdu strike Dharma just moments prior. Yet Mu Jin-hyuk merely grinned and remarked, "It seems you lads are enjoying yourselves. I suppose this is what folks refer to as after-school hours, right?" The others swiftly joined in the banter. Only at that moment did Ma Sakdu softly exhale. Simultaneously, he scrutinized the individual more intently. Indeed, it was evident that a person from the entertainment industry was appropriately attired, clad entirely in high-end fashion labels. On the exterior, he appeared quite laid back, with nothing evidently amiss about him. However, there was still an element about him that made Ma Sakdu sense that the man was somewhat unhinged. Nevertheless, a person of that caliber stood on par with Cho One-pil, which took him somewhat by surprise. Dharma ultimately could no longer restrain himself and inquired, "Chief, what prompted your unexpected arrival?" Mu Jin-hyuk casually extended his hand, lightly touched Pu on the shoulder, and directly stated, "I'm here to take this child today." It became apparent that he had already observed the child during the previous gathering, and had even contemplated that he would be an ideal candidate for a position at his establishment. Upon completion, he stated forthrightly, "I won't waste my time elaborating anymore," indicating decisively that he was taking the boy at that moment. Dharma's expression hardened instantly, and he could merely implore in a subdued tone, attempting to utilize insufficient personnel as a rationale to deter him from luring Pu. However, before he could even complete his thought, Mu Jin-hyuk's demeanor transformed abruptly. The charming grin disappeared entirely, replaced by a pair of wide eyes intensely fixed on Dharma. With a frigid grin, he remarked naturally, "I am fully aware of what you intend to express. However, the establishments on my end typically commence operations late in the evening, so there's no conflict in timing. I'm merely borrowing Pu for a short period." While he conversed, he gently placed a hand on Dharma's shoulder. Though it appeared courteous at first glance, it was undeniably a command. Dharma was seething within, yet he refrained from uttering a single word in response. Ultimately, all he could manage was a nod of acquiescence. It was only then that a contented grin reappeared on Mu Jin-hyuk's countenance, and he gently stated, "Now we're getting somewhere." Before too long, darkness descended, and the pair reached their intended location. The opulent skyscraper before them was the domain of Mu Jin-hyuk. Ma Sok-do had presumed it was merely another establishment, but when he glanced upward, he recognized that the whole structure was filled from one level to another with amusement venues. Pu inquired why Ma Sok-do had accompanied them. Ma Sok-do nonchalantly replied, "I'm the leader. Naturally, I must be present." However, the reality was that his true intention was to sway Mu Jin-hyuk to his side as well. At present, the most powerful faction within Hong Kong was led by Deputy Chief Park Wijyu. Therefore, Ma Sok-do required influence that could effectively oppose him without delay. His strategy was straightforward: gain the trust of the action team leaders individually and swiftly establish himself as a genuine confidant of Zhou TCI. Subsequently, he observed the wig adorning Pu's head and nonchalantly inquired about it. Pu clarified that if they were venturing out to conduct affairs, then image was significant. Initially, Ma Sok-do didn't quite grasp the concept. In his mind, they were merely present to provide security. However, he then recalled that Pu was at a stage in life where appearances held substantial importance. Subsequently, Mu Jin-hyuk approached them to offer his greetings and nonchalantly complimented his own discernment, stating that Pu appeared significantly more attractive with the wig. When the pair referred to him as boss, Mu Jin-hyuk promptly amended them and stated, "In public, address me as president." He subsequently inquired why Pu's companion had accompanied them as well, and Ma Sok-do deftly dismissed it with the identical justification as earlier. However, observing Mu Jin-hyuk behaving so relaxed and carefree, Ma Sok-do couldn't help but question how someone like him could effectively manage an establishment. At that moment, the two subordinates near the elevator spotted Mu Jin-hyuk and promptly lowered their heads in deep reverence. Ma Sok-do had anticipated that Mu Jin-hyuk would respond with the same languid smile he consistently donned. However, in the following moment, Mu Jin-hyuk's expression stiffened, and he sternly reprimanded the subordinate who had been positioned there with his legs apart. He emphasized repeatedly, "Security personnel are the initial individual's customers encounter. As you embody the visage of the establishment, how can you present yourself in such a manner?" Ma Sok-do and Pu remained frozen, utterly astonished. It was only at that moment that Ma Sok-do comprehended that when Mu Jin-hyuk was engaged in his duties, he transformed into an entirely distinct individual, exhibiting an extreme seriousness that bordered on severity. The individual, who typically appeared rather frivolous, nonetheless maintained a steady position as one of the leaders of Huang Gan's operational team. And Ma Sok-do found himself pondering how someone of that nature ought to be approached if he genuinely wished to win his favor. Upon entering the elevator, the two engaged in a hushed conversation regarding Mu Jin-hyuk. They had perceived him as merely a careless simpleton, yet as soon as the tasks commenced, he transformed into a completely different individual. Before long, the lift came to a halt on the 7th level. The moment the doors slid open, they both halted in their tracks. The corridor was filled with youthful males dressed in various attire, congregating in small clusters and creating a cacophonous disarray. Ma Sok-do was puzzled by the abundance of security personnel. Regardless of how hectic the location was, it still seemed illogical. Even if they were all present for interviews, each one appeared to be of a similar ilk to Pu. There was no conceivable way that a gathering like this could effectively manage genuine issues. Then an individual pushed through the throng and shouted to them, stating that the president had already issued the directive. "We are currently lacking in personnel, so the two of you must accompany us at once." The gentleman guided them right to a portal, and the moment it revealed itself, the scene within caused Ma Sok-do to halt in his tracks. Within, the opulently adorned chambers featured a gathering of women enjoying drinks and sharing laughter. Ma Sok-do promptly subdued his tone and inquired of Pu the nature of the establishment. Pu discreetly informed him that it was an upscale entertainment locale tailored specifically for female patrons. At that moment, Ma Sok-do grasped the entirety of the circumstances. They had not arrived to provide security in any capacity. Instead, they had been summoned to perform service duties. Hearing the unending banter and light-hearted comments from the women in their vicinity, Ma Sok-do was consumed by a singular thought. He had to escape from that place without delay. He was certainly not suited for that type of predicament. Initially, he needed to leave and afterward he could devise a different approach. However, just as Ma Sakdu was on the verge of seeking an opportunity to discreetly exit, he looked up and became immobile. Mu Jinhao was unexpectedly positioned outside the transparent barrier by the entrance, quietly observing all that was transpiring within. Ma Sakdu was unaware of the man's arrival, yet he did not have to ponder for long to understand the reason. Mu Jinhao was likely present to evaluate their progress. The two ladies in the room observed him standing there rigidly and promptly burst into laughter, playfully mocking him. "What are you hesitating for? Rush over and attend to us appropriately." At that instant, a single term resonated in Ma Sakdu's mind: trapped, as he was acutely aware that if he fled at that moment, Mu Jinhao would immediately sense it. Should that occur, his entire strategy to gain the individual's endorsement, draw him nearer, and leverage that relationship to counter the deputy chief's faction would implode instantaneously. However, in the very next moment, an idea abruptly crossed Ma Sakdu's mind. Given that this establishment was an opulent location designed exclusively for the benefit of women, perhaps it was the moment to demonstrate what true hospitality entailed. And immediately following that, amidst Payu and the others exclaiming in utter astonishment, with Mu Jinhao's completely incredulous gaze fixed from beyond the glass, Ma Sakdu revealed his ultimate gambit.